Hello, welcome back to the Metroball Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today we have the 7th and final part of our System Gateway review series. Today we have 8 Weyland cards and I think the last 3 Neutral Corp cards to talk about. If you're new to the series, we'll be going through all 8 Weyland Consortium cards and talking about the lore and flavor behind the cards, but mostly talking about how these cards work and what sort of decks and strategies they work well within. It's worth noting that we will be talking about these cards within System Gateway alone. I know there's a lot of players who have just entered Netrunner and are playing just System Gateway, so we'll be talking about that set. But it's also important to know that these cards are legal within the standard card pool. That's the large last 4 or 5 years worth of cards that makes this competitive format that a lot of people play in. So we'll be talking about both. It'll be clear when we jump from one to the other, I hope. Also, there's a lot of cards we're talking about, so there are timestamps in the YouTube time bar if you want to jump to something in specific. And if you like this video or you've enjoyed the series, if you want to give this video a like or subscribe to the channel, it greatly helps the Metroball Grid grow. Awesome. So let's dive in. Today, we're talking about the Weyland cards. This is honestly my favorite faction and has been for a really long time. And to understand who Weyland is, we're going to jump over to the Nisei Learn to Play page and read their couple paragraphs describing who Weyland is. Money is power. Power is money. Nobody knows the extent of Weyland Consortium's control, but they always make a profit. The world's largest conglomerate, they own, visibly and invisibly, hundreds of megacorps. Banking, security, arms, mining, construction, all are within their remit. No matter the situation, Weyland comes out on top. Rising beyond the Earth's atmosphere, the space elevator known as the Beanstalk has enabled Weyland's influence to extend beyond the global, to the orbital, the lunar. The future humanity is in the stars, and Weyland will stop at nothing to get there. Enemies of the consortium, and there are many, rarely last long. Buildings collapse, drone strikes go awry, bodies are found with bullets in their heads. Yet the blame is never theirs, because they were never there. Black Ops agents and PR teams ensure that. They exist in the shadows, pulling the strings to ensure their vision of the world is never compromised. And that, I think, is a good description of what Weyland is. Just let's start talking about the Beanstalk. From my understanding, this is how Weyland really made it big in the lore of Android. I don't know if that's entirely true. But if you don't know what the Beanstalk is a space elevator that was created by Weyland, Jack Weyland specifically. Jack Weyland was the head originally of the Weyland Corps, and Jack built his Beanstalk. This is the Beanstalk. The Beanstalk is a space elevator. The idea of how a space elevator works, this, mind you, is the root in Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken. Space elevator is basically a large construction that goes from Earth all the way into space. And it's a large, kind of like a string of sorts, a large tower. And space elevators are actually like a pretty sound idea that people are trying to pursue modernly. The basic idea is that if you build an anchored kind of structure at the equator, that's where it most makes sense, and you kind of build this tall tower, it kind of freestands on its own due to the way that the rotation works and gravity works, I guess. This is pretty naive, my understanding of physics, but the short of the long is, if you ever attached a weight to the end of the rope and then started spinning around, the rope stays taut. And that's the basic idea, that if you attach this sort of cable to a counterweight in space and attach it to Earth, the Earth spins and that cable should stay taut. And why that's useful is that instead of now using expensive rockets to send people and stuff into space, you can now build cars and climb up this rope that you've built into space. And this should help really bring a lot of people and a lot of stuff out into space, which will help a heck of a lot. And this is honestly an ongoing problem, figuring out how and with what to build a cable of this size. And this this construction has a lot of issues. There's a lot of problems. I think right now, a lot of like graphene type stuff, carbon-based stuff is being looked into to solve this. I think it's like a public $1 million question right now. And in the lore of Android, Weyland and their people invented something called Bucky Weave, which was the basic structure they use to build the space elevator. Now, on top of that, the name Weyland might be a bit familiar for those who maybe have some science fiction background. Weyland-Yutani, or the Weyland Corp, shows up a heck of a lot in the Alien series. They're the big funding corporation behind the scenes. And I don't have a direct answer whether this was an inspiration, but the similarities here are pretty striking. Now, the Weyland Consortium is a fair bit different than the other corporations within the Android universe. HB, NBN, and Jinteki are all singular corporations, where the Weyland Consortium is a conglomeration of different companies underneath the Weyland umbrella. And just like the Nisei paragraph said, that covers a lot of different fields. The only linking idea is that all of these corporations are massively profitable. So we have things like Titan Transnational in the banking sphere. Argus Security works in private security forces. We have Blue Sun generating power on the moon. Scorpio's defense system works in, I'm assuming, military or any sort of that sort of drone type technology. And it continues. Things like illegal arms factories, things like mining on the moon. All this stuff falls very neatly within the Weyland Consortium. The Weyland Consortium is actually not run by Jack Weyland anymore. Jack Weyland, from my understanding, has disappeared off into space on his quest for, I think, internal youth or something like that. And right now the board is actually run by this like very shadowy board in which all members don't know all other members. And this is the way that Weyland is run, from the shadows, controlling all these massively profitable and in some ways morally dubious companies. Now, the one, again, underlying rule here is that they're the one company that's probably the most concerned about their public image. And they largely need it because they get up to some pretty publicly reprehensible stuff. Now, this is a YouTube video from a pretty interesting talk given by Lucas Litzinger. He was the guy at FFG who rebooted Netrunner back in 2012 from the original Netrunner into Android Netrunner. And this is a talk at the NYU Game Center in which he talks about one of the big differences when rebooting the game was they added the idea of factions. In the original Netrunner, there was no factions. You just played Runner and you just played Corp. So the idea is like figuring out which factions to bring into this new game. When he was starting to prototype this, there was actually a lot more Corp factions. Argus Security on its own was its own Corp faction. Same with Blue Sun. And the eventual result of this was to make the Weyland Consortium that could take some of these factions and bring them together. You should check out this talk. It's actually quite interesting. Even hearing on the Runner side some of the different factions that could have existed that found their way within other homes. Now, in terms of how they play, there's a lot of things that are very specifically Weyland. And I think one of the biggest ones that differentiates them from all other factions is meat damage. We talked before about how Jinteki represents the net damage faction, and Weyland is the meat damage faction. And this card's Scorched Earth was printed in the original core set. This was one of the first cards in Android Netrunner, if you got back into this, 10 years ago at this point. And it is quite the card. It says if the runner is tagged, do 4 meat damage. So big reason to play Weyland back in the day was you would play the core set Weyland, you'd make a lot of money, and then you'd give the runner a tag through a card like Sea Source. Now, this card traces, and trace is not something that it exists within System Gateway. The short of the long is that you just throw money at each other. Whoever threw the more money is successful. And so the corporation would make a heck of a lot of money, tag the runner, and then do Scorched Earth, Scorched Earth. And that was the Weyland win condition. Much more often that would happen over them scoring agendas. And it kind of gave you a good example of how Weyland works. We found the runner and we flatlined them. We'd like to remind the press that some of the buildings in the blast were our own buildings. So it's only, of course, an accident. And that's Lizzie Mills, I believe, looking over at the wreck. Is that actually Lizzie Mills? I'm not entirely sure. That's the idea. And Weyland existing as this like aggressive, that they're hunting you down. They're going to find you and they're going to hurt you and they're going to do meat damage to you is alive and well within standard Netrunner still. And even in some extent within System Gateway. Now, Scorched Earth isn't a legal card right now. This rotated a while ago. We do still have other cards that have that same sort of idea. We have Boom, send a rocket to your friends. Cards like High Profile Target, they do that as well. But there's so many other interesting win conditions or these sort of meat damage cards that not only show you alternate win conditions. Again, the very suspicious looking man with the Nerf blaster shows up after you've stolen some agendas. That was your mistake, mind you, and hopefully gets a flatline. But this also shows kind of, again, the theme and how Weyland operates. These are the cleaners. A man, it's so strange. They go out of their way to make themselves look as suspicious and as sinister as possible. But you see this over and over again. A leaker found dead at their console. What a huge disaster. We have people tied up on lampposts in the middle of public squares. We have traffic was murder, and then traffic was murder once again. They send for housekeeping, and then they send for real housekeeping, and even the wake-up call comes with it. All this sort of stuff is like very quintessentially Weyland and so much fun. They send the hitmen after you and then complain when their shoes get blood on them. This is how Weyland operates. They don't operate within the law, yet there's generally no consequences within the game. If they know where you are, they can come after you and they can hurt you quite bad. Now, besides all this sort of violence, that way that they operate, that's sort of like blasé, we're too good for this, we can do whatever we want. That is also alive and well in a lot of their other play styles. When it comes to the economy, too big to fail is pretty on the nose here. And interestingly enough, whenever you see a Weyland financial agent or operative on a Weyland card, they generally come in one of two forms. One of them is with their feet up. The second is reclining. And if you're really lucky, sometimes you actually see them with both at the same time. It kind of gives you the proper tone here of how Weyland works. On top of that, if it's not murder, they do have these fun kind of clandestine ways that they work, whether it's this like crack team they ship off at night, or sometimes they're just shutting down the power in a whole neighborhood just to torch a bit of the runner's rig. And I think maybe this is like the piece, the Weyland direction, is the government takeover. And this is so wild, the idea that it's a very hard agenda to pursue, but it is something that a lot of corporations when playing want to try and pursue this. But it just shows the kind of difference when you look at something like NBN, where some of their goals align to things like, putting their branding on the moon, which I agree is not something I want. This is the Weyland final end game, and that's absolutely fantastic. Now, mechanically, another thing that Weyland has going on that's pretty unique is the idea of bad publicity. This art is so upsetting. But the idea is that they can do things that take on bad publicity. This is something that publicly doesn't resonate well with the population. And bad publicity isn't within System Gateway. How it works is if the corporation takes a bad publicity, anytime the runner makes a run, for each bad publicity they have, they gain a credit that they can use within that run. They don't get to keep it after the run if they don't spend it. But the idea is that basically the people, everybody is helping you out making these runs because they don't believe or they want to fight against the Weyland Consortium. Interestingly enough, in original Netrunner, bad publicity didn't work that way. If you got 7 bad publicity, you just lost the game as a corporation. In Android Netrunner, it's a bit more nuanced, and bad publicity will come when your business folk show up to a hostile takeover with their business folk and their business shotguns. On top of that, like Weyland has a lot of cards like that will trade off. I'm getting something now, I'll take bad publicity, but we're hoping to win the game sooner than that bad publicity catches up to us. And then the runners are running in on us, not spending any real money. There's an entire identity that revolves around this, mind you. This is basically a mafia. Now, sometimes the bad publicity is associated to this really scary ice. There's some really mean face checks you can worry about in Weyland. And I think the centerpiece here is this card from the original core set, still around today, called Archer. And Weyland does have actually some pretty mean ice that can be a surprise at the wrong time and just blow the runner's rig out. Archer is, I think, a really good example about that. And lastly, I think the thing I want to say about Weyland, and specifically about their ice, is advanceable ice. Weyland has always been the faction that loves to, or really wants to, or is forced to, advance their ice. Basically take time and credits to put counters on their ice and slowly make them better in strength, maybe make the subroutines better, or this is what we see in System Gateway. And this is something that's been alive for a really long time. Again, Ice Wall goes all the way back to the original core set. And it's not just the ice. It's important to know that Weyland has a lot more tools to support this playstyle. Things like the wall-to-wall or even Shimon from Kaguya, they all help. But this sort of advanceable ice archetype and setting up and building these defenses is something that is also very Weyland. Now, just historically, I think it's kind of important to know that Weyland classically was the worst corporation for a really long time. There's a lot of reasons why that was. This whole advanceable ice thing is actually kind of a big part of it. Weyland was classically receiving some of the worst ice in the whole game, just because advanceable ice, I think, as a concept is pretty bad and doesn't really pan out a lot of times. And they were getting a heck of a lot of it. And sometimes the support was really, really bad on top of it. But Weyland wasn't a very competitive faction for a long time. A lot of their best cards, the meat damage ones, the stuff that killed people, that usually got drafted into other factions. They would spend influence on those cards, and Weyland was kind of left to the side for a really long time. Now, that's not the case, luckily, anymore. Weyland decks are actually pretty competitive, and they have been really competitive for the last maybe year or 2 years, but it wasn't always the case. Weyland has classically been the sort of the black sheep of all the 4 factions, having some nice tools, but then falling apart in some ways. It's also kind of interesting because you would see these sort of weird ideas side by side in some of the Weyland cards. Sometimes you get something that seems really cool and aggressive, a dedicated response team. These are your your crack troops running up or down across walls and ceilings just to hunt down the runners. And sometimes that would be released alongside a card like, I hope you're excited about Crenulations. Like it was never very even keel about what they had. Luckily, that's not the case whatsoever within System Gateway. That's my overview of what Weyland was. They're generally very lethal, and the way that they play is fast and loose. They can find you and they can hurt you. Again, they kind of play above the law, I guess pun intended to some extent. They do advanceable ice. They can have some pretty scary ice, and that does exist within System Gateway. And I think that's largely it. They're pretty good at money too. They did have a fair bit of money, and I do think we do see the money within System Gateway. Now, this is our first System Gateway card. It is an identity. It's called Weyland Consortium, built to last. Just like everything within System Gateway, it's 40 card minimum, 15 influence to spend. And it says when you advance a card, gain 2 credits if it had no advancement counters. Here to stay. And I know we showed this just a bit ago, but just such a nice change from Because We Built It, which classically was one of the worst identities of all time within Netrunner that just let you advance something for free. This is a bit better. You advance something if it's the first advancement. And not only is it free, you gain a credit on top of it. And that's how this works. When you advance a card, you gain 2 credits. And advancing a card, you spend 1 credit on it, so you basically gain a credit back. So advancing the first time doesn't cost you a lot. That's good. That's quite good. What can we advance is the question. And there are 3 major things that you are able to advance within System Gateway, in fact, throughout the whole game. And that is 3 categories. You can advance agendas, and you generally need to advance agendas to win the game. You can advance ice, or specifically this one piece of ice within System Gateway. And then you can also advance things that aren't agendas that look like agendas, assets specifically within System Gateway. We're going to be talking about all 3 of these camps one by one because they're all pretty different and they're all kind of interesting. And we want to see how Weyland built to last interacts with all of these. So let's start with agendas. Agendas, I think, are some of the best case scenarios you have with built to last. The first time you advance an agenda, you gain 2 credits. So this is like gaining 2 credits. You need it to advance off-world office anyways, so you can install it, advance it, and you end up with an additional credit within your credit pool, and that's fantastic. Within any game of System Gateway, you're expecting to score 3 to 4 agendas generally. That number can go up if the runner scores agendas, but this is pretty good. It's rewarding you for doing the thing that you wanted to do anyways, and that's always good. It's different than something that you have to go out of your way to do and you're stretching yourself to try and get value of. You're going to get value from this in just about every game you play. And it's also a really good value. One of the central conceits in Netrunner is scoring an agenda, installing it in a remote server, and spending time and clicks and credits to advance it is going to slow you down. And that's the basic catch-up mechanism where now the runner can kind of come back. And built to last minimizes that catch-up mechanic. It makes it a lot easier for you to tempo out agendas and not have to spend too much money to do the thing that you want to do. I have Off-World Office open, which honestly kind of breaks that basic rule, but that's the idea. It lets you do the thing you want to do anyways, and it lets you do that at a reduced cost, which is fantastic. Now, this specifically really works well with the agendas within System Gateway. If we're looking at 4-2 agendas specifically, you can install this agenda, you can advance it, actually gaining money, and now you have additional money in the early game to perhaps res 1 or 2 ice that you put in front of that server. The idea is that if you want to rush an agenda behind a Palisade into a white space, firstly, to install both of those ice and to res those ice, that's about 6 credits. And on top of that, you're going to need even more money to score at the agenda. So the idea that you can install the office and advance it and still have more money in your pocket than you would with any other identity helps you get out that first agenda. And cards like Off-World Office are fantastic because if you score it, it snowballs, you get more money and you keep going. That's really good. On top of that, one of the big problems with agendas is if you say you did install advance and you spent a click and a credit to get this agenda on the table and then 1 more to advance it, and then the runner steals it, you lose a lot of like value. You've spent time and money on that agenda, let alone obviously you lost 2 points, but built to last minimizes that. If the runner steals the agenda, it's not the worst thing because at least you didn't lose any money on that agenda. The runner spent money, maybe you did resing ice, but it's just a pretty good trade there. That's fantastic. Also, cards like Off-World Office 4-2 agendas work really well within System Gateway. You have access to cards like Seamless Launch. So if you install this agenda, you don't even have to advance it. And as long as next turn, you advance it first, so you get your 2 credits. Mind you, built to last only triggers if the card has no advancements on it. And you can still score that agenda with cards like Seamless Launch. So you can, in theory, spend nothing, take on no risk, and still get the full built to last reward, which is quite nice. Now, this is actually really important, and specifically looking at Seamless Launch, this is actually more important once you look at the full card pool and you go to the standard card pool, is that the Built to Last ability only triggers whenever you advance a card. And there's a lot of cards within Netrunner. There's only one, I think, within System Gateway that also advances cards. But this card, Seamless Launch, it doesn't advance cards, it places advancement counters on cards. So if you use Seamless Launch on a card without any advancement counters on it, Built to Last won't trigger, because you're not advancing the card, you're placing advancement counters. And that might sound really dry and semantic and boring, but them's the rules. The only way that you can get Built to Last's ability out of all of the cards within Netrunner, the only card that matters is this card, the basic action card. The only way to advance a card is actually spend a click and a credit. So again, there's a lot more cards within the standard card pool that place or move advancements around, but the only way that that actually is going to get you built to last value is if you spend the click and credit to do that. So keep that in mind for sure. Now, we already talked about the idea of scoring agendas and retaining tempo is a good thing to do, just universally, and that is totally true. But Weyland, and this is a bit outside of System Gateway, does have good reasons why they want to keep their money up while scoring out agendas, because a lot of the Weyland card pool actually exists on putting a threat out. Now, punitive counterstrike isn't within System Gateway. I think maybe a better idea is looking at Public Trail, but cards like this can be expensive. And if you always want to threaten this, that the runner needs to respect it, you want to make sure that you're scoring agendas while always retaining over 4 credits. And that's a good way to do it in Built to Last that eases that scoring of agendas. Other things like Government Subsidy, you can keep your credits up a lot more easily, and then it's easier for you to play a card like this. You can even sometimes do install an agenda, advance it, and then Government Subsidy, which is nice if you're on 9 credits that gets you to 10. That stuff is quite good. On top of that, and this is quite interesting, in theory, it also, of course, any agenda is easier to score, and 5/3 agendas are actually really quite expensive. Install, advance, and the next turn 3 more advances. That's a lot of time and money. 5/3 agendas are actually really expensive to score, and Built to Last does make it a bit cheaper. There's honestly an argument, and I'm classically not a big fan of a lot of 3/1 agendas in the game, is that maybe you could put a couple more of these within your Built to Last deck just because they are significantly cheaper to score out in a Built to Last deck. The idea is that you end up scoring this for like, what, only 1 real credit, if I'm not mistaken? So that helps a lot because 3/1 agendas are also pretty expensive to only get 1 point. So that's agendas. They're just good. It's just universally going to be a good ability. We want to advance agendas anyways, so you're going to be getting the money for doing the thing you want to do. And if you score 4 agendas in a game, maybe you try and score 5 in a game, 6 in a game. That's 12 credits within a game. That's good. That's good enough money, and you're pretty excited to do that, specifically because it allows you to score them more aggressively and keep your economy while threatening agendas out at the same time. Now, the other thing that you can advance, there's 2 more things. So the second thing is ice. And there's only one advanceable ice within System Gateway, and that's Pharos. And we'll be talking a bit more about Pharos later on when Pharos comes up as a card to talk about. But Pharos is an advanceable ice, and the first time you advance Pharos, it doesn't do anything, but it gives you those 2 credits. So basically, you could technically advance this, and it's akin to clicking for a credit, right? Because you spend 1 to advance it, you gain 2 back, so you end up with 1 more credit. It is very, very similar to clicking for credit, but then you have 1 advancement on Pharos. Now, unfortunately, Pharos with a single advancement doesn't do anything. So if you want to advance Pharos, you're generally planning to get it up to 3 advancements. And we'll be talking about a bit more about this later, but Built to Last makes it a bit easier to get it to 3 advancements, but this first advancement itself is akin to clicking for a credit. And then from that point on, you can continue and pursue that Pharos if you want to. But I do have a big warning here. It is worth noting that you can advance face down ice. So you always could see, oh, I have a Pharos in front of R&D. I want to advance my Pharos because I was going to click for credit anyways. And now that's better for clicking for credit because not only do I have that credit, but now I'm closer if I decide to triple advance the Pharos. And I would argue that that's actually a really bad play. If your ice is face down and you advance the Pharos, you are giving so much information to the runner because there's only a single ice within all of System Gateway that can be advanced. So as soon as you advance that face down ice, you're basically telling the runner, like, that's not a white space. That's not an ansel. you know that the corporation needs 7 credits to res this. And when they res it, it's not a really good res. 7 credits to give the tag and end the run. We'll talk about that later. You know that you need a cleaver or your Marjana to get through it. You're just giving like just so much information to the runner. Oh my God, if they now know to tread lightly, then you don't have 10 credits. Like it's a really bad thing to do. So what I'm going to say is we'll talk more about Pharos later. But if you're advancing Pharos face down just to gain a credit because it's better than clicking for credit, you probably shouldn't do that. It gives so much information to the runner as long as the runner is familiar enough with the whole card pool and system gateway, which I reckon they'll get to that point soon enough. Now, lastly, and maybe the most fun, agendas are good, but maybe not as exciting, is advancing things that aren't agendas. And you have 2 cards like this within System Gateway. You have Clearinghouse, which you can advance, and eventually this could be lethal. This is your meat damage, mind you, within System Gateway. And Urtica Cipher, a trap, which if the runner runs, they take a bunch of net damage, and sometimes they flatline if they take too much net damage. And I'm a big fan of this. I actually think cards like this are really important within System Gateway. There's going to be a lot of situations where you have a couple pieces of ice on the remote server. The runner knows what they are, and you need to put something in the remote server to force the runner to run. It's really good to put something in the remote server that looks like an agenda, but when the runner runs it, it turns out it's something they have to trash for 3 credits or they take damage. That stuff is really, really good. So being able to do these sort of plays, and mind you, these sort of plays are very expensive. We're going to talk about this a lot, specifically when we talk about advanceable ice. Advancing cards is a very expensive part of Netrunner. Not only are you spending a credit to advance your Clearinghouse, but you're also spending a click. And a lot of times, most people, when they look at the game in Netrunner, they value their clicks to be worth 1.5, 2 credits. So not only are you not gaining 1.5, 2 credits, advancing yourself towards some other win condition, you're spending a credit on top of that. So advancing cards is inherently a pretty expensive act to do. So you want to make sure you're doing it when it makes sense. But the idea is that Build to Last helps you get that install advance Clearinghouse or install advance Urtica Cipher a lot cheaper. In fact, it's nearly free. In terms of credits, it is technically free, but you do have to spend the time, which you could have spent doing anything else, I guess. So that's nice. I like these cards a lot in System Gateway, and I'm playing with a lot of them. We're going to be talking a bit more about how the existence of these 2 cards on top of Send a Message and Neurospike together make a really, really cool pool that you can play with, this really cool mind space. And we talked about this a lot in the Ninja Techie video. So I'm a big fan of that. And I think you can quite easily put 1 or 2 Clearinghouses in your Weyland deck and play them and not lose too much value on them, even if you just have popped them to do 2 meat damage and jam something the next turn if the runner doesn't run for it. Now, all in all, I like Built to Last a fair bit. That's how it looks in System Gateway. You probably don't want to advance your ice all the time. Advancing agendas is good. I like playing Clearinghouse and Urtica Ciphers within System Gateway, and I like that a fair bit. You're going to make a fair bit of money playing Built to Last throughout the game. And I like that a lot more than some of the designs of some of the original Weyland identities. I found Building a Better World to be pretty boring. A deck that just wants you to put all the transactions in them and you just play them and they're better. There's not a lot of consideration. It just seems less fun and less interesting. And I like this a lot more. It incentivizes you to play with some of these fun cards specifically that are much more fun than Beanstalk royalties, and also allow you to jam agendas more aggressively, which is generally a fun and a Weyland thing to do. We didn't mention this a lot of the time. Well, I guess we mentioned this a bit when we talked about Weyland, but Weyland has largely been seen as the rush corporation. They're one of the corporations that says, I'm going to try and win by turn 10, either by flatline or jamming agendas out really quickly, because sometimes they fall apart in the late game. And Built to Last does represent that pretty well. You can aggressively jam agendas when you start advancing them, you also get money at the same time. It feels good. I'm a big fan. Now, how does this look outside of System Gateway? And it's actually quite interesting. Everything still falls within those same 3 camps of agendas, ice, and assets, and technically upgrades of things you can advance. So if we look at the agendas, there's a lot of things that work really well with Built to Last. This is Hostile Takeover. It's an agenda that you can effortlessly score from hand. It's a 2-1 agenda. And when you score this, not only do you gain 7 credits, you'll technically gain 9 credits with Built to Last and take a bad publicity. That's fantastic. That's a huge burst of money. It's 1 point out of hand, which is fantastic. That just feels good. And any of these like small agendas, and there's good reasons to play some of these actually become a lot more playable when they become better econ cards. You can actually play Standoff technically as a pure econ card within Built to Last. Admittedly, you do have to read that small text, but it's pretty cool. On top of that, Oaktown renovation, man, this thing is so wild in Built to Last. You install this face up, public being a thing that shows up on some Weyland agendas. And when the first time you advance this, you gain 4 credits. And this perfectly embodies the idea of Weyland saying like, hey, there's an agenda in this remote. I have a lot of money now. I can afford the ice I put in front of it. Do you want to run and risk the reprisal of meat damage or something scary like this? That's sort of a Rush corporation that is really trying to fly close to the ground. And it's just fantastic. Advancing this, gaining so much money, this really allows you to be aggressive and push through the early game into the mid game. It also allows you to res some of the scarier ice. Technically, if you install an ice, install Oaktown and advance it, I think you have like, what, 7 credits to res a piece of ice? Is that correct? You'd have 5, install, advance 6, 7. Yeah, so you're a bit short of Tithonium, but you can actually res pretty quickly in the early game, some of the more expensive ice when you have an aggressive rush like that. And it can incentivize you if you have more money quicker in the game to be able to res some of the scarier ice. Tithonium, mind you, works really well with standoff as well. And on top of this, having that early money while jamming agendas at the same time means that you can afford all these other win conditions. Hard-hitting news requires you to outtrace the runner, and being able to jam agendas while keeping your tempo out, that's fantastic. We talked about punitive counterstrike before. Okay, the runner did get in and steal that 5-3 agenda you put on the table and advanced once, gaining money. And now you have more money to send that squad to watch the fire, and cards like Trojan Horse as well. It's just good stuff. You want to be jamming agendas throughout the game, and this gives you more money to do it, and even faster, which is awesome. Now let's talk about ice, and ice is like pretty interesting. I have a lot of opinions about ice. There's about 13 ice that are advanceable within the standard format right now. Builder technically doesn't count here, and they range. It's again, we're going to divide everything into 3s, and there's 3 different categories of advanceable ice. It is also very much worth noting, by the time that I'm recording this, 2 cards just recently, as of last week, got banned by Nisei. So if you want to play the standard card pool, the card pool we're talking about right now, 2 very important cards in the advanceable ice archetype have just become banned. Mass Commercialization was a card that rewarded you very, very handsomely for advancing all of your ice at least once. This is now banned. And while Red Planet Couriers isn't banned itself, this was another card that worked with that Mass Commercializations combo and represented a win condition. So these Mass Comms Red Planet Couriers decks, there was a couple of them, and they've proven to be pretty competitive over the last month or so, are now banned. If you want more information on what is and isn't legal, check out the Nisei website. This is the new ban list as of 2106. These 6 cards are added. The whole ban list is at the bottom. So that is worth noting that the value of advanceable ice as an idea has gotten a fair bit worse due to the banning of mass commercialization. So just keep that in mind, knowing when I'm talking about this, because we haven't entirely seen the change of how people play with advanceable ice after this. That being said, mass commercialization was not always played in every deck that had advanceable ice in it to some extent. Okay, let's talk about advanceable ice. 3 categories of ice. The first is ice that just gets stronger the more you advance it. Cards like Ice Wall. You res it, cost 1 strength, barrier, and the run subroutine. Not bad. If you keep advancing it, every time you advance it, it goes up in strength linearly. There's other cards like this. Firewall, just the big sister of Ice Wall, same idea. And Mesfingo gets more subroutines the more you advance it. And these sort of ice generally don't see a lot of competitive play. And specifically, if they do, they generally aren't advanced all that much. The idea is, if I'm playing Built to Last, do I want to put Ice Wall on my deck? And my response is definitely not. I really don't want to do this. We talked about this before, but advancing ice, you need to understand, is incredibly expensive. If I'm spending, admittedly, the first time you advance your Ice Wall and you spend a click to advance Ice Wall, you can advance that in Built to Last to get the first advancement counter. And it is akin to clicking for a credit. Instead of clicking for a credit, you click for a credit and make your Ice Wall 2 strength. And that's okay. That's fine. That's technically better than clicking for credit, but admittedly, you also have Ice Wall in your deck, which isn't a very flashy or special ice. Also, making Ice Wall 2 strength doesn't really matter when most of the breakers, that doesn't change the math on what they break it for. So that's a bit iffy, but you're technically right that you are getting more value from your Ice Wall than clicking for a credit. And that's a reason why Ice Wall shows up in a lot of Built to Last decks. Now, admittedly, advancing Ice Wall and continuing to advance Ice Wall is so expensive. Let's talk about outside of Built to Last. If I have an Ice Wall on the table and then I spend my whole turn, I spend credit, click, to advance it, and making a 4 strength Ice Wall. You might think, wow, I saved a lot of money making a 4 strength Ice Wall. That's pretty good. Compare that to a Bastion that costs 4 credits. But not only did you technically end up spending 4 credits to do that, you spent 3 extra clicks. So I'd argue that you built yourself a bastion, but it ended up costing you somewhere around 6 to 7 credits because your time is so valuable in this game. Standard right now as a format is pretty quick. A lot of games are over in 10 to 15 turns. So spending, 3 of those, or one of those turns, 3 clicks, just making one of your ice a bit better just doesn't really line up in Netrunner. Now, admittedly, there's a lot of cards that we'll be talking about that support this ice building strategy, and not a lot of people are sitting there advancing their ice wall. There's a lot of cards that will help you do that for free, and those are really good cards, and they make these sort of cards better. But just understand, these sort of ice that just get linearly better when you advance them aren't very flashy. They don't show up a heck of a lot because advancing them generally is not a good proposition. A lot of times you could have just played better ice there, and you generally don't have the time and or money to advance that. That being said, Built to Last makes that first advancement cheaper, but the difference between 1 and 2 advancements on Ice Wall is pretty negligible most of the time. Again, it's another thing that we talked about before. You can always advance ice even if it's not rezzed. And say you have an ice wall on R&D, face down, unrezzed, and you're thinking, I'm going to advance this instead of clicking for a credit because it's better than clicking for a credit. Again, just keep in mind, you're giving a lot of information to the runner. They know, okay, that's not a border control, which is something they might have to play around. Oh, that's not an archer. That might be something they have to play around. These sort of things are very, very impactful. So advancing a card that's face down does betray a lot of information to the runner. Keep that in mind. And on top of that, if advancing your ice wall up to 10 strength sounds amazing, kind of, but it is worth noting, and these cards show up a heck of a lot in any conversation about ice, is that cards like Boomerang, cards like Botulus that don't really care about the strength of the ice kind of invalidate that strategy. And these show up in just about every Anarch deck, every Criminal deck, even every Anarch deck. Hopefully Shaper is playing a couple Boomerangs. So even just building the big ice that you spent 4 or 5 turns on, that's not going to pay out too well. Now, the second kind of advanceable ice is actually a really interesting kind of advanceable ice. These are the space ice. There's 4 of them. They came out in order in Chaos, the deluxe set, and they all work pretty similarly. They usually cost 9 credits, and anytime you advance them, they lower the res cost by 3. So this is an ice that you specifically want to advance when it is unresed on the table. Again, giving some information to the runner. Now, what's cool about these ice, you generally don't want to or can't afford to res these for 9. Having a code gate that costs 9 that has 7 strength with a pretty good subroutine honestly isn't the worst. It's not good, but it's not the worst. But the idea in Built to Last is that if you advance this once, that advancement is kind of akin to 4 to 5 credits. And then you're advancing your wormhole for 6. Is that good? Probably not like competitively super good. I think it's worth trying out because it looks kind of fun. And then you feel better about advancing your cards. Because this card on its own is actually kind of hard to deal with. 7 strength is really awkward. Again, Black Orchestra pumps a heck of a lot to get through this thing. Now, again, admittedly, we do have some problems. Single subroutine ice doesn't look amazing right now, but that is something you could consider. It is clumsy, but I think it's kind of fun. And lastly, we have the third kind of ice, which is the ice that generally has these breakpoints in terms of advancements. We talked about Pharos from System Gateway. That's a good example. It only gets better with the 3rd advancement. We have cards like Whoredom that the subroutines get better and it becomes impervious to AIs on the 3rd advancements. Mouseless, the subroutines get better. Aket, not only does the strength get better suddenly in the 3rd advancement, but you can't break both the subroutines. Colossus, same idea, plus that sort of ice wall strength thing. These cards actually end up seeing a lot more play than any of the other advanceable ice that we talked about before. And that big part of that is that these cards are just good, even if you never advance them in the whole game. Massless is a really taxing piece of ice. It's a nice thing for central servers, or sometimes it ends up on a remote, but it's really hard for people to break this for 4 credits. Some of the subroutines generally consistently fire. They're all kind of annoying. Aket is fine for 2 strength, 2 subroutines for 3. That's pretty good. The face check on this is also not bad. You gain a credit and gain an advancement. That's good. And Whoredom is also just fine. These cards are good enough. And that's a big reason why these cards show up in decks that even without advancements, they're fine. Now, the interesting thing in Built to Last is, if you advance any of these cards, it does nothing. Of course, it's better than clicking for a credit, but advancing a Mouseless really does nothing for you unless you continue to advance it and finish it off. Colossus, mind you, is a bit different. It does have that ice wall ability, which is nice. And so it's true. Built to Last helps you. It makes it cheaper to get to those 3 advancements if you'd like to, and that's good and fair. A lot of times it's not worth triple advancing your Mouseless. You almost never triple advance your Whoredom unless you're specifically against a matchup that's really relying on an AI, and that's kind of nice to have that ability. think Arquette's honestly one of the best ones because having the subroutine always fire generally helps all your other advanceable ice, and you're playing a fair bit of them. But these are not cards that I'm like really excited to spend the clicks and credits advancing. And again, while I've kind of been like poo-pooing advanceable ice to some extent, it's important to know that there's a lot of good cards within the format that help your advanceable ice get better. But the issue with Built to Last is Built to Last only gives you value if you advance a card with no advancements on it. So if you have your Arquette that's been wall to 2, if you want to give it that third advancement, you're not going to be gaining money. It's not incredibly clumsy. It's a bit clumsy. And more often than not, you first advance your Arquette as clicking for a credit and then wall finishes it in 2 turns. That's honestly, it's good. But I think my big story here is that I'm not really excited to advance ice. I don't think it's really good. Having it be click for a credit plus just doesn't excite me. The same sort of way that like Hyobu Institute's click for a credit plus also isn't exciting. Clicking for a credit isn't a best thing to be doing anyways. Having a slightly better click for a credit is, it's okay. I'm just not jazzed about it. I'd rather the wall do everything than me having to spend a click and advance it. Now, we talked about having all these cards with a single advancement on it doesn't do anything. And that's actually a really big change because that used to not be the case only 2 weeks ago. There's a heck of a lot of decks that would just, because Built to Last made it so easy, install all the advanceable ice and just advance all of them one, not losing any tempo, clicking for a credit. And then they would mass comms for like $16. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist anymore in the standard card pool. And that is definitely a bummer for these sort of archetypes. Because again, we talked about Built to Last wanting to advance everything once, but there's no point advancing Whoredom once. There's sometimes no point advancing it 3 times. And the one card that really cared about that is gone. That's a bummer, I guess. Sometimes this card frustrated me, but it is worth knowing that the value of this kind of fell off a cliff with mass comms being banned. Now, the one thing that I'm kind of surprised is that there was no card I was expecting when we saw Built to Last spoiled within the early spoilers. I was convinced that we'd see a piece of ice that we would advance that got some value when it was advanced, but also got some value when you took the advancement off of it. That would incentivize you to advance it and then lose the advancement counter to be able to advance it again. This is the closest example I have. This is an old card called Mamba, and Mamba gained power counters, and then you could choose when to use the power counter to do something cool, and then it could gain another power counter. And I would have been so excited if Built to Last had a card like this. A card that got value when it was advanced once, and then lost value because you used that value, and then Built to Last would be very easily able to refill that better than any other faction in the game. Because right now, there's no reason to really advance everything once, barring, and we'll be talking about them in a second. There are a couple combos, but it just doesn't work that well. I'm not excited to single advance a Mouseless. Now, that being said, in the full card pool, there are some good reasons to advance some ice, besides the ice getting a bit better. In some cases, pretty good, a lot better. I think a big one is Trickle Light. Trickle Light is fantastic. You can play 4. There are 4 3/2 agendas you can play within Weyland, even more if you want to play some of the neutral stuff. But the idea is that if you advance a card for 1, clicking for a credit, Built to Last, you can advance the ice again, paying out of pocket, and then you have this battery that you can always install on an agenda, Trickle Light, sometimes Trickle Light twice off of 2 different cards, and then score out 3/2 or 4/2 agendas from hand. That is worth doing. Trickle Light is expensive. Advancing cards is expensive. Mind you, Wall to Wall also really helps with this. Wall to Wall is such a good card. That is a win condition. And we talked about Red Planet Couriers. This card wasn't banned, which kind of was a surprise to some extent. But with Red Planet Couriers, there is a good reason to get advancements on a bunch of different cards. You can advance all 6 of your ice on the table once, and then Biotic Labor, install something like a Project Atlas, a bigger agenda if you want, and then play Red Planet Couriers to move all the counters to that Project Atlas. And you can have an Atlas with like 7 agenda counters on it. It's really cool. There was a very competitive deck that worked like this, and it worked quite well. So there are some reasons. I think there are some reasons. But I think the one thing I want to say about ice is that there's no good reason to single advance a piece of ice, barring if you really like that 6 strength firewall. And I feel like a lot of times the best stuff you can do is stuff that you clicklessly advance stuff anyways, if you do want to advance things. Now, lastly, we have cards that you can advance that aren't ice, that aren't agendas. They're cards that go in remote servers, and these are pretty good. This is NGO Front. It's a very, very prevalent competitive card. It looks like an agenda. The runner runs it. Boom. You suddenly get 8 credits. They spent time and money going through your ice. It is so good, and it's even better in Built to Last. You make even more money off of this. And then there's other fun cards. Cards like Reversed Accounts. It's a trap. If they don't run it, it's going to be really bad for them. Cards like Biovault are, again, things that you have to advance to get that very, very nice sudden end the run ability. And all of these things are a lot cheaper to do. And mind you, again, advancing cards is very expensive. I've been playing some Jinteki personal evolution decks, and how these decks work a lot of times, they go install advance, and they want to put a bunch of traps on the table, hoping that the runner runs the wrong ones, doesn't run the right ones. And this is very expensive. And the idea that Built to Last can kind of pull that off, they're just missing one or two real like good traps for that to be viable. This deck incentivizes you, or the identity incentivizes you to jam things that aren't agendas. And a lot of cards that look like agendas and aren't agendas are really fun to play, and a fair bit of them are incredibly good. Now, lastly, always something we have to say anytime we talk about System Gateway, it's a 40 card minimum deck, which means you can play a 44 card deck with only 18 points of agendas in them. And that means in Weyland, you have access to some really good 5/3 agendas. You can play 3 of each. And now you have only 6 agendas in your deck, and the runner has to steal half of them. On top of that, these 5/3 agendas have some pretty good win conditions attached to them. You have punitive counterstrike and faction. As long as you have a credit differential, they steal a single 5/3 agenda. Mind you, this can do a lot of meat damage on the way. Punitive into punitive is lethal. On top of that, you have cards like Neurospike that also work well in that strategy. There are some really good decks with very low agenda densities. And these are 2 decks that we saw recently. And these are actually some of the reasons why those mass commercialization and actually government takeover, mind you, got banned, funny enough, is that these decks would run 3 hostile takeovers, 3 global food initiatives that are technically worth 2 points in the runner score area, and a government takeover. And the amount of agendas you need to steal to win the game is nearly all of them if you can't steal the government takeover. The idea is that building a 40 card deck, and specifically in this one, Mendax's deck also had access to punitive counterstrike. It's pretty rude. So having small agenda density, having extra win conditions, having good money, 5/3 agendas that are pretty good is good. 40 card minimum deck size is fantastic for Weyland. Even if you just want to build a rushy Weyland playing smaller agendas, 3/2 agendas, 4/2 agendas, you have a smaller deck, and that's generally considered more reliable. So it's a thing worth playing. I'm a big fan of Built to Last. I think it's fun. I think you can do a lot. There's a lot of flexible builds. I'm not a big fan too much. I'm kind of glad card decks like this were banned. Admittedly, maybe banned a bit too soon. We haven't seen what the counterplay looks like entirely, but I'm happy I don't have to play around that. But that being said, this ability is fun. It's that sort of rush Weyland. It incentivizes you to play traps. I'm not a big fan of advanceable ice, but I like this a heck of a lot, specifically compared to some of the old Weyland identities. Oh man, this is such a nice breath of fresh air. Now we have our first agenda. This is above the law. It is a 3/2 agenda with a security subtype. And it says, when you score this agenda, you may trash 1 installed resource, limit 1 per deck. We are judge, jury, and executioner. So System Gateway introduces 1 3/2 limit 1 per deck agenda for every faction. And this one is quite good. You score it, you trash a resource, and that's fantastic. It's hard to trash resources. The only other way to trash resources is the runner has to be tagged, or you have to tag them. And then you have to spend a click and 2 credits. That's a lot. And you're getting all of that attached to 3/2 agenda. It's just good. And it's aggressive. And it's the sort of Weyland, we see you, we find you, we're going to hurt you ethos. And I'm glad to see that in System Gateway. Now we're talking about resources within System Gateway. There's only 5. And honestly, this probably doesn't hit as hard as it could in some other like Welcome to Netrunner like core sets. The resources here, there's not that many that I think I'll be that excited to trash. I think the best case scenario a lot of times, like trashing any resource in System Gateways, hitting a verbal plasticity feels quite good because card draw is pretty limited within the format, and trashing the card draw card is fantastic. Hitting a telework with 6 credits on it's good. Red team, you're feeling good. There's a lot of money on it. Cookbook and smartware distributor, sometimes not necessary to trash, but if you do, you probably don't feel bad about it. But it's pretty straightforward. You put it on the table, it looks like anything. And that's one of the beauties of 3/2 agendas. You can just put it on the table behind ice, and the runner might not think like, oh, that could be an agenda, could be a Nico campaign, could be a Managarm Skunkworks, it could be just about anything. And so they might not run it. And then honestly, that allows you the possibility to just score this right away and maybe trash something or trash nothing, or even wait until the runner like installs something. They think, okay, they didn't score that last turn. It's probably just the Managarm stewing. I'm going to set up a bit. I'll play the red team. I'll play my verbal and set up. And then you can strike with the impending satellite. So I don't think it's a very nuanced card. I think it's interesting to see whether people hold this on the table because, again, without any advancements on it, it looks like anything. It looks like a defensive upgrade. It might not be pressured if it's not scored immediately, and that's kind of cute. But a 3-2 agenda, you're really excited about that in System Gateway. And having a 3-2 agenda that on its own, you don't need to over advance to get value. That's never happened within the Weyland card pool. And that's so cool to see. And I'm really happy. I'm really excited, excuse me, to be able to trash for real plasticity. It feels really good. It feels really mean, at least for one player. Now, if you go outside of Gateway, there's a lot more resources. Standard has 106 different resources, and runners do play a heck of a lot of resources. In competitive Netrunner and standard Netrunner, there's a lot of resources that show up consistently as 2 or 3 ofs in most competitive decks. Just about every Anarch deck is running 3 liberated accounts, and this doesn't always get cleared so quickly. So jamming out an early above the law, trashing a liberated, ruining 12 credits. Oh my god, that's fantastic. And even the small stuff in Anarch can be good. Paladin Puemo represents like 10 to 20 credits throughout a game sometimes. So trashing a Puemo early or at any point in the time is quite fine. Criminal, you got Class Act. This shows up. It's good. Trashing that is just good. They lose their ability to filter their draw. That can hurt them a heck of a lot. Classically, Shaper has relied mostly on some of the big resources. Shapers also will not be that aggressive in the early game all the time. So sometimes they'll set up professional contacts, click 1, turn 1, go down to 0 credits and start clicking up and drawing. I don't think that's a really big thing modernly. The meta is a bit faster than that. But in theory, they might not be well equipped to contest an early above the law. And if you take down their professional contacts, they're in a really bad spot. Other cards like Aesop's Pawn Shop can be a large part of their economy engine, and trashing that is also very good. Neutrally too, daily casts, Earthrise Hotel, these aren't on the table forever, but even if you just get some value off the table, trashing a full Earthrise, oh my god, that's disgusting. And you feel good about that. And these cards show up pretty consistently in just about any deck. The cool thing about this too is that it's a card that you can put in your deck kind of akin to a Silver Bullet card. There are some what people call silver bullet, or tech cards that people will play in their decks to help against certain matchups or certain cards. No One Home is really good. It's a 1 influence, 0 cost card you can put in your deck to help you against net damage or tags. And so this ends up in decks. And if you're a corporation that wants to kill somebody by tracing them and giving them a tag and then hitting them with meat damage, No One Home or a card like Citadel Sanctuary might represent a huge problem to you. So having an access to a card in your deck that, again, it's hard to ensure that you score this at the right time, considering it's a 1 of in the deck. Maybe you could go out of your way and play a digital rights management. I'm not sure. It gives you a card that can help you in that matchup. If you see a runner puts down an early Citadel Sanctuary and you do have some punitive counter strikes or some hard-hitting Muses in your deck, pulling down the Citadel Sanctuary does feel really quite good. On top of that, it's a 3-2 agenda, so even sometimes you can fast advance it. We talked about Trigger Light being pretty strong, specifically in Built to Last 2. You can double advance a piece of ice that's advanceable at not too big of a cost and score this from hand, perhaps at the perfect time where the runner has installed that resource that you're waiting for. Also, Audacity, amazingly strong card. This is a card that can fast advance out of hand at almost no cost, almost at any point in the game, and there are some times where you'll throw your whole hand just to hit a resource and get 2 points on the table. This is a cool deck. PolyG put this together, and you see this sort of agenda suite shows up a lot in Weyland. Weyland will play a lot of these 3-2s, 2-1s, a lot of these smaller agendas, and just constantly be jamming behind some of their bigger ice. This deck is a bit different than some of the other Argus or Outfit decks. And I think the big point that I want to say here is that Above the Law will find play in almost every single competitive Weyland deck that isn't specifically relying only on 5-3 agendas because they're doing something like Punitive Counterstrike. I think in any other Weyland deck that's not running specifically 5-3 agendas, you're going to see Above the Law in all of them forever. Well, until this card rotates out, or I don't know how Standard looks like in 5 years, but it's going to be there. And it's also really hard to play around. I don't think you can play around that. I don't think there's that many resources right now that if they come down, decks fall apart. Professional Contacts classically kind of sounded like that. So it's a hard card to play around as a 1-of, but this is going to be in every Weyland deck. And I'm very interested to see how much fear this is going to go instill. Whether runners, I don't think as a runner you want to be, precious with your resources. I think you still install them. You can't say that's an unadvanced card. I don't want to install my Earthrise. But sometimes this is going to connect, and I think twice burned or whatever the expression is. I'm a big fan of this card. It's a good Weyland. It's a great 3-2 agenda, and it's going to make some really, really flashy plays. Our next Weyland card is Clearinghouse. We've talked about this one a bit. It's 0 to res, fantastic. It's 3 to trash, so that's nice. It's a hostile asset, and it says you can advance this asset. When your turn begins, you may trash this asset to do 1 meat damage for each hosted advancement counter. There's a quote that says, first rule of the business, make sure you're not personally liable when the transaction executes. And it's credited to Ted J. Sun, Central Counterparty Clearance. Now, it's not that obvious in this art, either because it's small or because the quality of this one on Netrunner DB is not too strong. But if you look at David Lay's art, there's 2 things here. Firstly, if you haven't seen this before, David Lay was commissioned to draw these giant arts, and then Nisei cut them down to do 2 different cards. So on the right, we have Clearinghouse, and on the left, we have Government Subsidy. But if you see here, actually the things, oh, that didn't work the way I thought it would. The things being loaded into this tank here, or into this APC kind of thing, there's people. This is actually Weyland taking these like giant ATST or ATT, I forget which one it is, walking drones are actually capturing people in some sort of like snatch and grab type operation. It is like the sort of quintessential fly-by-night Weyland garbage that they're up to. And any card that like, does meat damage and suddenly can kill you, that shouldn't be too big of a surprise. Now, we've talked about this card before. It is an advanceable card, so Built to Last does get here cheaper, and it is a card you put in a remote server. It looks like an agenda, you can advance it, and if the runner doesn't run it, on your next turn, you can always pop this to do 2 meat damage, or you can continue to advance it and maybe threaten lethal. Again, most runners have hand sizes of 5, so if you have 6 advancements on this and it survives a turn, the runner will be flatlined and you win the game, and that is a really exciting win condition to chase. This is pretty minor. I don't think it's really important for this card, but it's worth saying. It says when your turn begins. That trigger is technically before you mandatory draw. Not that it should matter too much, but it's not that you can draw your card and see, oh, that's an agenda. I want to get this out of the remote server, so I'm going to pop it. So you have to decide to do this before you see the card that you draw off the top of the deck. And on top of that, it is worth knowing that you can always res this card before your turn starts, at the end of the runner's turn, or technically at the beginning of your turn. So you don't need to res this when you advance it. You want to advance this face down, and you only have to res it right before you're going to fire it. So you don't have to show the runner what you're up to. Now, cards like this go into remote server, look like agendas, aren't agendas. These classically are kind of quite good. There's some caveats. NGO Front is a really good example. This card kind of blew up that archetype of cards that look like agendas that aren't agendas. NGO Front is so fantastic. You put it in a remote server. If your runner runs it, you pop it. Suddenly you gain all the value they spent all the time and money. Fantastic. We have other cards like this, like reversed accounts, and reversed accounts and Clearinghouse fall, I think, a bit closer to one another, because if the runner runs it, it's still technically good for you, because the runner generally has to trash these for 3 credits or face the consequences. It's not like gaining the 8 credits from NGO Front, but it's technically still something that they have to deal with. And if they don't deal with reversed accounts, or in theory, if they don't eventually deal with Clearinghouse, they're going to have a problem on their hands. Now, my favorite part about Clearinghouse is not exactly its existence, and we've talked about this in the Jateki video, but its existence in relation to some of the other cards within System Gateway. And that's specifically this like triangle between Clearinghouse, Urtica Cipher, and 5/3 agendas attached to Neurospike. Let's just say Neurospike here. And the idea here is, it's really devious. Say you have a Clearinghouse and you install Advance It. Now, generally when somebody installs Advance as a card in a remote server, a lot of the times it looks like a 5/3 agenda. So they're deciding, do I run that to be able to steal the send a message? In theory, it could be any sort of agenda, mind you. Or do I not run it? And if they don't run it, generally if it's a 5/3 agenda, you will go advance and score it out, scoring 3 points. Now, the interesting thing with Clearinghouse and Urtica Cipher is that sometimes the best play you want to do is just to continue to advance it. For Clearinghouse, it's pretty obvious. If you get this to 6 advancements, the runner's in a really scary place. But even sometimes with a send a message, if it is a send a message in the remote server, sometimes the best thing you can do is advance this to 4 advancements. Because if this is at 4 advancements, on your next turn, if it survives an additional turn, you can advance, score it, and then do Neurospike into Neurospike. And that will do 6 damage and also flatline the runner. And as you continue to advance, the idea of what these cards can be gets scarier and scarier. As the advancement goes up, there's a bigger threat between it being soon the lethal Clearinghouse. And on top of that, it could also, if they go and check it and try to trash it because they need to deal with the Clearinghouse, it can be that lethal Urtica Cipher. And this is just like the perfect sort of Yomi mind game that you want in a game where you install all your cards face down as a corporation. The idea that one of these they have to defuse and the other one is lethal, potentially lethal. Now, if they don't run the Urtica Cipher, they'll be safe, but they might never know. Interestingly enough, one of the best things you can do in an Urtica Cipher, if the runner doesn't run it after you install advance it, is just to continue to advance it. When it's on 4 advancements, it looks like a send a message into Neurospike, which they have to respect. And as soon as you advance your Urtica Cipher to 6 advancements, it's such a big problem for the runner. Because if that's a clearinghouse, they die. And if it's an Urtica Cipher, they need to run this and take 8 net damage, which is usually lethal as well. And so just the existence of a card that you want to continually advance and then you don't want the runner to hit, a card that the runner doesn't want to hit that you can continually advance, and also a trap that lives somewhere in the middle is just so perfect. I'm a big fan of this card. I love the space that the Nisei team gave us to play with, that you have all 3 of these options and that you do get that cool headspace. A lot of times in the original core sets is a bit more simpler. It's more like, is it a trap? Is it an agenda? And now there's actually some stuff that'd be like, whoa, it's at 6 advancements. That's a really, really huge risk if it's an Urtica Cipher and there's a reason to bring something to that height. I'm a big fan. And even if you don't want to goof around with this Urtica Cipher, send a message, Neuro Spike stuff, and I'd argue you don't even need send a message, Neuro, just Urtica Clearinghouse is scary enough. You can also just protect this. Heck, you could even res this sometimes. Even if the runner knows what it is, a lot of times you can build an Anoetic Void, Managarm Skunkworks server that the runner just can't get into. And if you can get 6 advancements on this, mind you, you can always over advance this with Seamless Launch or advance it a bit faster. It's not amazing, but it's technically faster to get the 6. That can be lethal as well. So there's going to be decks that just run as few agendas as they can. I guess in System Gateway, you have pretty limited options. And then just try and get that clearinghouse as protected as possible and get it up to 6. On top of that, it is worth knowing you can play cards like, it's not reliable, but if you can do some net damage in the middle of the turn, it can help you get to that lethal. Maybe you can even Neurospike if they stole an agenda and then hit them. Or technically you would have to clearinghouse them first and then hit them with the Neurospike. You don't all have to do it all in one shot with a clearinghouse. Bonus points if you have multiple clearinghouses and you fire 2 of them to get a lethal. That's cool. And on its own, again, it's a card that looks like an agenda and it's not an agenda. And I think those are so important. Runners are going to run remotes. They have cards that are there in their deck to get them into remote servers. So having something that they run on that is an agenda that forces them to use their money, their breakers, sometimes it's their mayflies, like that's good for you. And if they don't run it, it's still okay. Sometimes you can just pop that for 2 damage. It's fine. Now, outside of System Gateway, I think there are some more direct routes to lethality. I think Dedication Ceremony is a heck of a card. You will have to res the clearinghouse, or Dedication requires a face-up card. But in theory, if you have the right hand, you can build a remote server that is nigh untouchable. Maybe you have cards like Anoetic Void. You have cards like Border Control. You install the clearinghouse and you do Dedication Ceremony. In 1 turn, suddenly there's now a threat with 6 advancements. Mind you, that is a 3-card combo that if the runner doesn't deal with, they lose on the spot. There will be decks that do that. There will be decks. How reliable will they be? I don't know. Runners right now are pretty good at contesting like 1 or 2 ice servers with things like, you know, Botulus and Boomerang and stuff like that. Maybe the upgrades are necessary there. But yeah, that is quite something that you can actually present a threat pretty quickly. And Built to Last also, again, you get there a bit faster as well. On top of that, you have cards like Red Planet Couriers. This is kind of nifty. You get all your advancements in 1 turn suddenly onto your what's it called? Onto your clearinghouse. Now it's a bit awkward because you have to have the clearinghouse pre-installed unless you want to biotic labor to get that clearinghouse down. But in theory, you can suddenly say there's 20 advancements on clearinghouse, survive this. And if they can't deal with that in that turn, it's going to be a problem. You also have cards like La Costa Grid, which sometimes you just put cards in the La Costa Grid servers and they just get free advancements. And it looks like you're just advancing a Managarm's Skunkworks or an Anoetic Void in there. And if the runner doesn't run it, suddenly you got 6 advancements for free. I think there's some cool decks that can pull that off. And I've actually been playing a heck of a lot of Clearinghouse within Jinteki Personal Evolution decks. We talked about these decks, these sort of trap decks. The idea is that every turn I want to install advance something. And sometimes they're Ronins. And if the runner doesn't run it, excuse me, wait, it's probably better to open with this. If they're Cerebral Overriders and then runner runs it, it's a problem. But maybe they're scared of their advancements. And if I can have on the table maybe a Ronin or 2 that's advanced pretty heavily and a Clearinghouse, they can die out of nowhere. On top of that, you do have access to other cards like Neurospike and Snare to make it a bit easier. I've been really enjoying these sort of decks. But Clearinghouse has a home in that. It is 3 influence, which is a fair bit, but having that 5th and 6th thrown in, that reason to advance things and say install advance, go. You don't even have to ice them up, which is really fun. As Clearinghouse, I'm a big fan. I think there's going to be decks that are just going to protect this as their win condition. There's going to be decks that want to put this as a trap and play some bluffing. I think there's going to be decks that don't ice this. I love that there's cards like this within System Gateway, cards that show the importance of information, that show the bluffing aspect of the game. And I like that this is our meat damage card within System Gateway to show you that Weyland is not playing exactly by the rules that some of the other corporations might be following. Now, our first ice, this is Ballista. It is 5 to res. It has a single subroutine. Mind you, it's a sentry and a destroyer subtype. The single subroutine says trash 1 installed program or end the run. It says it puts a hole in your rig and your plans. Quote from Lou. It is 4 strength. There's only 2 influence. It's worth noting that when it says trash 1 installed program or end the run, because this is the corporation's card, when and if that subroutine fires, the corporation decides. It's not the runner's decision to trash 1 installed program or end the run. It's the corp. So the corp will pick the worst of the 2. A Ballista, mind you, it is a siege weapon or a ranged weapon. This goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. There's generally 2 kinds of ballistas. They kind of look like oversized crossbows. And the idea is that you load in either a rock or eventually I've seen, like spears or kind of like sharp stuff, and you fire them and they fire pretty dang far and they can do damage to people and to walls. Again, this goes back to ancient Greek and Roman. And this is something we've actually seen as a recurring theme. We've seen other siege weaponry show up in Weyland cards. This is Trebuchet that showed up in Downfall, a really fun and actually very similar Weyland card, a destroyer subtype. I'm a big fan of this card. Also, a huge shout out. This is Owen Sinodov's art, and this art is just so refreshingly different. You kind of see you definitely see that sort of like Ballista shape with the sort of like the cross strut and the kind of the sharp thing loaded into it. This looks so different than a lot of other stuff within System Gateway, and I'm actually a big fan of it. So this is a 5 strength ice that trashes installed program or ends the run, and it gives you the best choice of the 2. And this immediately reminded me of an old card. This is Grim. And while this wasn't technically a Weyland card, I think I've only saw this back in the day in Weyland decks. When you res this, you took a bad publicity. It had 1 more strength and it just trashed a program. And this card was scary. This did show up in these sort of like rushy Weyland decks that had some program destruction in it. It's things like Swordsman, Grim, Cobra, Archer. These are all ice that would trash programs and they would rush out pretty quickly. And if the runner got too careless and you got a credit advantage, you do that classic C-source into Hedge Fund. I mean, Scorched Earth. You don't want to play Hedge Fund. You do. It's fine. And this is a more interesting card than Grim. You do have the choice between trashing something or end the run. And in some cases, and man, this might be petty, but it actually makes us feel worse, So the best case a lot of times when you play Ballista, you want to trash a program. Let's be honest. You want to hit that program. The runner installs their Unity and runs a remote server thinking that they need this to get through the white space they assume is there. And then you trash the program and you feel great. You've done that Weyland thing. You've destroyed something, but then you realized this doesn't end the run. And that's kind of the bummer with this card, is that this is technically, in some extent, a positional ice. A lot of times you want to get that Ballista in front of something like a Palisade. So now if the runner runs it with a cleaver, they think they want to get through a Palisade, you trash the cleaver, and then the Palisade does that, that end the run that you need. So that's what I've been finding with this. And again, having an end the run sentry is definitely still pretty good. But unfortunately, the part of this that I'm most excited to use, a lot of times I can't use because I just need this to end the run, which is a bummer. It's admittedly a bit of a silly thing to complain about, but see how often you can actually trash a program and feel happy about it, as opposed to using this to end the run, which it isn't the worst end the run, that's for sure. And I think this actually is a really good point when it comes to Netrunner, and specifically in System Gateway. I've been saying this all the time when I'm teaching runner, face check anything. Face check any and everything. Because if the corporation has to res this and pay 5 credits just to end the run, that is a terrible trade for them. Generally, most ice that they want to put in their deck has some sort of face check. It does something to you. And there's some face checks that are a bit worse than others. I think white space is technically one of the worst face checks. Losing 3 credits is pretty rough. The 2 damage from Karuna, I'm not that worried about. But having them pay 5 credits just to end the run is bad. It's not a very good trade for the corporation. And I think this is also a really good reason. Sometimes you see newer players will put down their programs. They'll think like, okay, I want to run that remote server, but I think there could be a code gate on it. I don't know. So I'm going to install my program and then run. And basically what I love doing is I want to install as little things as possible and then run as much as possible to force the corp to res as much as they can. Then you'll get more information and then you'll know what you need to install. There's so many reasons why this is something that you want to try and do as a runner, and Ballista is a good example of it. If this trashes a program, it's better for the corporation. You don't want to have your programs trashed. So it's in your best interest to not install programs until you need them. Now, admittedly, sometimes you might not have enough clicks, and if you pre-install it, it'd feel good. But if you install your Unity, now the corporation knows not to install their white spaces, and that's a lot of information. So again, a lot of times the best thing you can do, just slap down and start running. Get your penny shaver down and start hitting things. Force the corp to res, because if the corp has to res the Ballista on HQ for 5, just end the run. Oh, that's a bad trade. Now, in terms of a sentry that ends the run, honestly, that's pretty cool. That's okay. It's not the worst thing. There's about 42, I don't know, somewhere around that sentries right now within the standard card pool. There's much less. There's only 4 in System Gateway. And having a sentry that ends the run is actually really rare. There's only about 9 that end the run. The former carry doesn't technically count. So having an end to run sentry in your deck is actually kind of interesting. It's something that's kind of rare. Generally, it's not a thing sentries do. So that's kind of notable. Now, within System Gateway, these are your 2 options as icebreakers to break your Ballista. And a lot of times we just want to look at the numbers and look at the math and see which breaker is better if you're assuming there is a Ballista, and how good is Ballista based off of how much credits it is to break. And both Carmen and Echelon are actually, they don't break it too easily. Carmen gets through for 3 credits, which paying 3 credits to get through something that the corp res for 5, that's like not amazing for the corp. That's okay. System Gateway, things are a bit different than like the standard card pool. Echelon can be pretty awkward. At some point, if you have all your breakers out, you will be breaking the Ballista for 1 credit, which is pretty bad, but it's going to be a while until the runner gets there. So Ballista honestly isn't too taxing of a piece of ice once it gets spun up. A lot of the times, things like Palisade, things that cost a fair bit less than Ballista, are equally taxing in the format. So a lot of times if you're playing Ballista in your deck, it's because you want that first subroutine to specifically either end the run in the early game, because a lot of runners aren't rushing down their sentry breakers, or to trash a program. In the mid to late game, it's not an amazing tax. And I think my least favorite thing about Ballista, and I think I just got burned by this in the first 1 or 2 games I played in System Gateway, is that someone just put a botulus on it and then it's useless for the whole game. And that's kind of some of my thoughts about Ballista. I don't love it. I feel like a lot of times it won't trash a program. I think runners should be face checking without programs in this format. And then eventually it does get botulus, and that's just kind of it. It's useless for the whole game. You spend 5 credits for that privilege. And if you compare it to some of the other sentries, like this is on sell, and on sell is influence, that's for sure. But for 1 more credit, you get 3 subroutines that can also trash runner cards. It can trash programs. Of course, the runner can click through this, but this just seems like such a better sentry compared to this Ballista. I keep opening that. I mean to be opening this. Again, I'm aware you can click through the on sell, but I just never feel good resing it. It's kind of like a funhouse. If the corporation reses a funhouse and I'm not going tag me, a lot of times I'll just gladly bounce off of this. Them paying 5 credits to end the run is not a good feel. I think one of the things that might be even a bigger bummer specifically is that Weyland really needs good sentries right now. This list is from 2020, and it shows you the kind of mid-range sort of rush Argus decks, these Weyland decks. And in terms of the sentries, they're running a single archer. And back in the day, they were running 3 Data Ravens. These were the sentries that would show up in a list like this. And Data Raven doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by the Funhouse, which is now a code gate. So trying to find sentries that go into a Weyland list is very difficult. There's not a lot of good choices anymore. Surveyor used to be pretty prevalent, but you need a certain deck for that to work. And I don't think Ballista is going to take its spot. Again, we are talking outside of System Gateway. And if you look at some of the numbers, Begalter, once it is up and ready, you're breaking it for 4 credits, gaining 2 on the refund. So the first time you break it for 2 isn't amazing. Now, MK Ultra is actually pretty good. You actually have to boost twice with MK Ultra. So you pay 6 credits to get through through the Ballista, which is pretty good. But I'd argue most of the time that's not going to happen. A lot of Anarch decks modernly are only playing a single MK Ultra, and then again, relying on things like Botulus to be able to break those single subroutine ice. So not my favorite. Now, when it comes to the Weyland archetype of trashing programs, cards like Archer, that also needs to be evaluated because it's not always as easy and as powerful as it might sound. Within System Gateway, trashing programs is pretty good. It's a lot better. You know, you generally only have 2 of each program in your deck. Now, admittedly, you do have access to other cards like Mayfly and Tranquilizer and Botulus, other ways to deal with ice. But specifically within the standard card pool, trashing programs, things that the Ballista wants to do is actually like way worse than it might look. Almost the entire Anarch faction is running bin breakers, cards like Paperclip, MK Ultra, and Black Orchestra. So if you throw them into the heap, they will just come back. So it's not that useful. Shapers almost entirely are all running Simulchip right now. So even if you trash a program, they can reinstall it on the spot, usually for free. So a lot of times trashing programs actually lines the best around criminals. A lot of criminals are only running singletons of all their breakers. And if you trash them, they have to rely on other things like Boomerang. Maybe they have an Amakua. So even within the standard card pool, having something to trash programs isn't as valuable as it once was at a point in the game. Just the ability to recur programs is actually pretty strong and is seeing a lot of play. So I'm not even excited for a Ballista to trash a program if that does line up, because it's only really good against one faction. Admittedly, though, if you do trash like an Amina against a 419 list, it does feel it's going to be pretty good for you. That's for sure. But that's Ballista. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think within System Gateway, it is a bit rough, specifically playing against Anarch. A lot of times I don't want to res them or install them. If they do connect, it feels good, but the amount of times I've had to res this down in the run is pretty underwhelming for me. And I'd rather have a Palisade. Admittedly, Anarchs don't have a killer though, so sometimes this can be tricky. Our second piece of ice, this is Pharos. It reses for 7, it's a barrier, and it's an advanceable ice. It says you can advance this ice. It gets 5 additional strength when there are 3 or more hosted counters on it. It has 3 subroutines. The first reads, give the runner a tag, and then the second and third are both end the run. It's 5 strength, so it'll be 5 and then 10 when it's triple advance, and it gets 3 influence. Another art by Owen Sinodove there. Now, this is an ongoing theme. We've been seeing Weyland Ice coming out for the last, I think, 2 years at this point that are ancient wonders of the world. Pharos is the lighthouse of Alexandria, otherwise sometimes called the Pharos of Alexandria, which was a giant ancient lighthouse in Egypt, in the north part of Egypt here. And the art on the card really nails what this looks like. This doesn't exist modernly, does it? I don't think so. But we've seen other cards like this before. We've seen Mausolus, which is meant to be like the mausoleum of at Halicarnassus. We've seen Hortum, or off the Latin hortus, meaning garden, the gardens of Babylon. And now we have Pharos. There are 2 others as well that we have. Now, this is an expensive barrier. It's an advanceable ice. Again, if you advance this once, you gain a credit instead of spending a credit advancing it with built to last. And we talked about advancing face down ice is actually a kind of a thing you don't want to do almost at any point in the game within System Gateway. And when it's triple advanced, it is 10 strength, which is doubling its strength and makes it the highest strength card in all of System Gateway. Actually, one of the highest strength ice in the whole game, or modernly in standard at least. So 7 to end the run and give the runner a tag. This is a very expensive ice. I like that this card doesn't just end the run. And we talked about that with Ballista. Spending 5 credits with Ballista just to end the run feels bad. It's kind of a bad trade. And that this thing actually has a real face check attached to it is nice. Now, giving the runner a tag, well, we've talked about tags a bit before, and we'll talk a bit about it later. The tag sometimes isn't that important. And I think there's a lot of matchups in which you can just float the tags and the tag doesn't matter. But if the runner clears the tag, that's a click and 2 credits to remove the tag. So that's a pretty good face check. That's 3 credits of tags, which is nice. And 2 end the run subroutines is also quite okay. Now, I'm not a big fan of this card. On its own, if you look at it, 7, 5, 3 subroutines is actually very familiar or very comparable to Bran 1.0. Now, both Brawn, which is very similar to Pharos, are both very quite taxing ice. Barriers are kind of hard to deal with in System Gateway. There are 2 fractors, one being Cleaver, one being Marjana, and they're both very bad at dealing with high strength barriers. Cleaver is going to end up spending at least 5 credits to get through Pharos. It's going to spend, I think, 7 to get through Brawn, and Marjana is even way worse. There's a lot of subroutines. If you can't, first ability can be quite expensive. So both of these are actually really quite taxing. Now, you could always triple advance Pharos, and within System Gateway, that's also very expensive. Now, you get your first advancement cheaply with built to last, but then you have to spend 2 clicks and 2 more credits, which not only makes Pharos the most expensive card, but then it continues to be one of the most expensive cards in the whole game, or within obviously all System Gateway, when you're spending even more time and money to get this to 10 strength. And from my experience, that's one of the things with both Brawn and Pharos is that even if you could make Pharos 10 strength pretty reliably and pretty quickly, it's not too big of a problem for most runners. Just about every Anarch you're playing with has 3 copies of Botulus. And admittedly, those Botulists might be taxed out on other cards like Ballistas and other things that they want to break. But that's one of the problems with Pharos is that a lot of times the Cleaver is going to go through the Pharos. It's the Botulus that's going to go through the Pharos. And sure, 3 subroutines is definitely pretty good. A cookbook or 2 might help that Botulus. I guess you can only have 1 cookbook. But the idea is that even if you make this 10 strength, a lot of times the runner is just going to find a way to get through this for free. Same technically goes for the Brawn. At least Brawn is a bit cheaper. Now, Criminal has access to Tranquilizer, and Tranquilizer is such a big deal. If you triple advance after rezzing for 7, you're Pharos, and then it gets de-res, spending another 7 credits to get that back up is also a huge problem. And that's one of the liabilities of Big Ice. The idea is that criminals, sure, will really struggle to deal with this if they are playing Marjana, and I reckon a lot of criminals within System Gateway will end up playing Cleaver, is that Pharos is going to be coming down sooner than later. It's just such a big target. And then finally, Tau and Shaper can easily play Botulus or Tranquilizer, but more importantly, can just move that Pharos that you've triple advanced out of the way to a place where it doesn't matter. And that's kind of the issue is I don't love these huge investments into Big Ice. There's just such good tools within each faction to invalidate them that in a lot of ways, I'd actually be more excited to have a card like a Palisade or even Brawn. I do like Brawn a fair bit. I think Brawn is it's cheaper. It feels better than this. But the point is, like, a lot of times I'd actually rather have a Palisade. I really would. Palisade comes in at 4 strength. The difference between a Palisade and a Pharos, mind you, Palisade costs less than half the price. You're losing 2 subroutines, which if they're using a Cleaver, cost them 1 extra credit, and you're losing 1 strength. So you're trading a 3 credit difference to break for less than half the cost. Like, that just doesn't line up to me pretty well. So there's not a lot of times that I'm excited to res a Pharos for 7 when it is very comparable. Now, of course, the face check on the runner giving a tag matters if the runner cares about the tags. A lot of them, I don't think, have to in the format. But again, it just doesn't compare really well to some even the basic and the run ice. Maybe I'm off the book here, I think, or off the mark, excuse me. But like, I really, a lot of times, if ever I draw my Pharos, I'm not excited to it. And I've almost never advanced this to 3. And every time I have, I've been heavily punished by some of the best tools to deal with some of the biggest ice in the game. And on top of that, like when it comes to having really big ice within System Gateway, the more I play it, the more I'm finding that some of the best defensive options you have in System Gateway are not attached to the ice itself, but to Anoetic Void. If I could have a Palisade into an Anoetic Void, that is better than any single Pharos or any 3 advanced Pharos you could have in the whole game, largely. Like, this alone is just so absurdly taxing. So I guess Palisade still goes down to Botulus, but whatever, everything does, doesn't it? So yeah, that's kind of my way that I look at Pharos. It's big. Its face check is okay. I'm glad that it has a face check there. We've seen cards like this before. This came in the original core set, and Hadrian's Wall saw almost no competitive play for forever, a really long time, besides out of the just core set meta. And that makes sense. This ice just doesn't do anything. Paying 10 to end the run and have this like big wall in front of you, just it's not exciting. It doesn't do enough. It's not a good investment. Or cards like Toll Booth that actually face check well and are always taxing. A Botulus to Toll Booth always costs you 3 credits. That's a big difference. I'm aware that these cards are in System Gateway, but this kind of shows what better Big Ice looks like, at least to me. Now, of course, if you do have a deck with Pharos in it as the most expensive ice within System Gateway, it's a good reason to play Send a Message. If you're rezzing those Pharos for free, they do seem a lot better, that's for sure. So you can always go ahead and do that. Also, of course, the tag subroutine does look a heck of a lot better in Reality Plus, where sometimes you can end up rezzing this for just 5 credits. Once you get the refund, if the runner's face checking into this, a Pharos for 5 is, oh, it's getting closer to that Palisade, ain't it? But yeah, no, that's okay. That is okay. Now, outside of System Gateway, we did see this car seat competitive play. And it talked about the whole idea of having this big ice that you set up and then you advance and you're spending time and money advancing your ice isn't really a winning strategy. And it works specifically really well in these sort of decks, because these are the sort of decks that were doing the dedications, not the dedication ceremony, sorry, doing the Red Planet Couriers play. So a lot of times these decks didn't ice up anything besides their central servers. They would have a wall-to-wall remote at some point in time, and then just combo out of hand to score the government takeover. And again, this deck doesn't exist competitively anymore because the Nisei team thought this was unhealthy for the game. But this sort of deck that didn't care about tempo, they could just advance the Pharos, put it in front of R&D, pull it in front of HQ, get all the free money with mass comms. They could afford to play this lug of a slow, big old card. I don't think it works that well anymore. Now you do have cards again. It's advanceable ice. You have cards like wall to wall that get it higher strength sooner against. You don't want to advance your ice as much as possible. You have cards with priority requisition, so you can install it pretty cheaply and get free advancements on it. That's nice. You have cards like Ensign Rose, which can help. Ensign Rose is an interesting card, doesn't see a lot of play. You have cards like SSO Industries that will quickly get it up to 3 advancements, which is quite good. Heck, you even have cards like Building Blocks that you could consider playing. It's not that good, actually. You only save 2 credits. Never mind. You do save install costs, I guess. On top of that, though, like, it's another big issue. And again, as the same kind of issues you run with in System Gateway, Boomerang is a heck of a popular card. And Boomerang deals with the Pharos not perfectly. You're still going to take the tag. But the fact that you can get through a 10 strength ice for just 1 Boomerang feels good for the runner. On top of that, like, if I want to spend good money on a big old ice, I'm much more likely to try and lean something like towards something like the Bulwark. Admittedly, this does come with bad publicity, which is not a good idea for decks that want to go into the mid to late game, because that bad publicity really does add up in the runner's favor. But the subroutines on this are just so much better. They're so much better. The face check on here is better. The strength is better. It has an AI tax on it. If you want big barriers that end the run and do something mean, I'd much closer or much sooner look at Bulwark than I would want to look at Pharos. Our next card, it is an operation. It's called Government Subsidy. It's a transaction operation. It costs 10 to play, but don't worry, it's going to gain 15 credits when you play it. So basically, if you have 10 credits, you play this, you gain 5. And there's a quote. It says, if the government spend 1% of the funding they provide us tracking where the other 99% went, my colleagues and I would be in prison. That's a very big if. From Huey to Mora, WCon Public-Private Facilitation Seminar. Awesome. And we saw this art a bit earlier today. This is from that mega art from David Lay. I scrolled in the wrong direction, I think. And that's these folks over here. I think actually this might be a reference. I think it's not entirely it, but there was a narrative that was up on the Nisei website about Weyland sending some operatives to talk to, I think it was a mining operation. These people here, and actually in yellow, this armor we've seen before, specifically also these gun types we've seen before. These are Argus security troops, the Weyland identity, and you see these private security force troops. And interestingly enough, they don't have the Argus logo here on the shoulder pads. I do know that Nisei does want to distance themselves from some of the names and characters within the Android universe itself. And you also see specifically these guns too. This is an alt art that Nisei put out for preemptive action. And you see the same troops with the same guns. Now, this is a government subsidy. In theory, it's a very simple card in terms of words on a card, ignoring the flavor text. This is basically as little as it gets. It's a card you pay for 10, gain 15. And this is a direct reprint, mind you, in a Weyland home of Restructure, a card that used to exist all the way back in 2013. It's no longer in the standard card pool. Same idea. Pay 10, gain 15. And this card saw a lot of play. There was a lot of decks that had big money, that wanted big money. Gaining 5 credits is almost going to be universally good as long as you can ensure you're at the 10 credit threshold. This is also very interesting because we talked about this before. IPO was a card that was pretty universal in almost all corporation decks. This was a card that did the same thing. It cost 8, gave you 13. So click for 5. Although this did come with the restriction that you had to play it for the last click in your turn. And IPO did rotate out of the standard format. So now there's a lot of corporations that want to res some of the bigger ice, want to have more money, more liquidity, that are looking for a card to replace IPO. And government subsidy easily could be it. That 10 credit breakpoint to play government subsidy is actually really interesting because on turn 1, if you play a hedge fund, or excuse me, a system gateway hedge fund, you'll be at 9 credits. So you can't actually play government subsidy off the top unless you want to do credit into government subsidy, which a lot of times means government subsidy is actually like a 2 or 3 turn play. A lot of corporations will say hedge fund, ice up a central server, maybe click for credit, something like that. And we're hoping that they'll be able to play the government subsidy on their following turn. And that's actually one of the big reasons, specifically against some of the Weyland decks in System Gateway, that it incentivizes you to be aggressive in the early game. Say that the corporation put a Pharos on an HQ and they have a lot of agendas in it. If the corporation needs to res the Pharos and spend 7 credits on it, it's going to be another year before they can play the government subsidy. It is in your best interest in a lot of ways to drop that penny shaver and start going aggro and forcing the corp to spend money. Because if the corp doesn't have money, they can't play the subsidy. This is such a big deal. Forcing the corporation to answer your threats so they can't just sit back and gain the money It's really important when you're playing as a runner because you need money to make money in Netrunner, and this government subsidy card is a perfect example of why that is. Now, classically, these sort of like big econ cards, this would be well at home in Weyland. We talked about how Weyland decks of yore would play cards like Sea Source and leverage that huge credit differential and then throw the book at you with cards like Scorched Earth. And interestingly enough, that doesn't exist within System Gateway. There is no card that the corporation can like directly translate their economy into a win condition outside of specifically having money to do the things they want to do, like res ice and score agendas. So it's less threatening than it might have been back in the day, where you used to sit against a corporation, across from a corporation that had 30 credits while you had 10, and you thought, well, if I run, I'm kind of dead. So at least there's going to be a bit more interaction. And again, that interaction is really important. You want to make sure the corporation doesn't have money to be able to get here. I think that's largely all I want to say about government subsidy. You have one influence that's really easy to include into just about any deck that you're building a system gateway. Econ's a bit light within System Gateway. It's a limited format. And if you're finding yourself, like sometimes it might be difficult just to get up to the 10 credit threshold. And you might have to play a bit conservatively for a turn or two, maybe not res on that run in R&D so they can get one good access and then next turn recover from it. And I think it's important to play around that. And also as a runner, of course, to force that out. I do want to give a shout out to the other 5 credit 1 influence card, Hansei Review, which has some other interesting conditions attached to it. You have to discard a card to gain your 5 credits on top of playing the Hansei. But the cool thing about Hansei specifically is that you in theory can play Hansei on turn 1 and then click 1 turn 1, have 10 credits and go immediately into government subsidy. So there's actually these two technically do play well together. That's going to be a bit difficult because you have to throw out like or play most of your hand on that turn. That's like 3 cards out of your starting 6 after your mandatory draw. That can be difficult. But Hansei Review is a nice enabler that you can get up from the 5 credits straight to 10 and get right over that government takeover, or sorry, government subsidy hump. Question is, which of these cards do you play in your deck? I think a lot of it's going to be playtesting. Are you hitting that 10 credit threshold consistently? Or do you have extra cards in your hand you find yourself discarding within System Gateway? There's a lot of card draw in System Gateway. Hansei Review is not that hard to play. I think either, if not both, can end up in your deck. And this is a really cool card that teaches runners to be aggressive to keep the corp down. Outside of System Gateway, I think you always have to mention Weyland Consortium, Building a Better World, the original Weyland identity. It's a transaction. Click for 6 is good. That means you can technically hedge fund into government subsidy on turn 1. You can do start your turn on 16 credits or end your turn on 16 credits pretty easily. And it's a lot easier within the standard format. There's more cards. It's easier to translate economic advantage into a direct win condition. We talked about punitive counterstrike. If you have more money than the runner, you can kill them if they steal your agendas. Hard-hitting news, if you have more money than the runner, you can throw a bunch of tags at them. Trojan horse, on top of that, if you have more money than the runner, you can trash some of their programs. This is quite expensive. And you also have some of the bigger, meaner ice to be able to res quicker in the game. It's also comparable to another transaction we have, Too Big to Fail, which is a 7 credit gain off of a single click, which is wild. Admittedly, though, it's attached to bad publicity. And that is technically comparable. And I'm interested to see some of the lists that are like whether some decks are going to stop playing Too Big to Fail and instead play the subsidy. And I don't think that's the case. A lot of those decks are faster, and spending a single click on 7 is better, admittedly, than a single click for 5, obviously. But it is worth shouting out that a lot of those decks could play both of these cards. Too Big to Fail is, I guess in some ways it's awkward because if you're over 10 credits because of the subsidy, it's hard. But the cool thing about Too Big to Fail is that you can play it on 0 credits to gain up to 10 very quickly in the outfit and then jump over it to 15 with subsidy. So I think there's some good reasons to do that. Again, as one influence, there's a bunch of decks that could consider playing it. Pollen of Foods does get money pretty quickly. Runners have to draw generally, and you have some of the bigger ice in the game. So government subsidy could work. These are the sort of decks that classically could or would play Restructure, and you do want to watch out for that. On top of that, pressure again. Same thing as it is within a System Gateway, putting pressure on the corporation, forcing to the res, taking their money away. If you see that government subsidy on the top of R&D on turn 1, probably start smashing. Make sure that they're not going to be able to play that because they definitely want to play that. That is so good money as long as they can float the 10. It's a good card. For one influence, we'll see it. Funny enough, when Restructure existed, this was back in the day when Weyland was such a bad corporation. A lot of people just wish that, oh, I wish Restructure was just a Weyland card, just so all the other decks would seem worse because they had to spend more influence on Weyland cards so Weyland would look better. And funny enough, we've got to that eventuality. Not that Weyland technically needs the support, I guess. We have another Weyland operation. This is Retribution. It's a gray ops op. It costs 1 credit and says play only if the runner's tagged. Trash 1 installed program or piece of hardware. You really think you'd get away with it? I love how regardless of how advanced technology is, just sending some goons in with a baseball bat ought to do it. We've talked about this card a fair bit when we did the NBN System Gateway review. Maybe there's like a link up here to the video. But a big point of this card is that it is tag punishment. And right now it is currently in a faction that has very limited amounts of tagging. In System Gateway, if you're playing Weyland and you're not splashing out of faction cards, there's only 2 ways to tag runners. There's a face check on Pharos, which is by no means consistent, or the neutral orbital superiority, which also requires setup. You need to score this, have a click left over. You can do it if you'd like to. So if you want to play this card, you're going to have to probably spend some influence putting yellow cards in your deck. And again, we talked about this card within the NBN deck review because the NBN cards really wanted to tag you. And this is only a 1 influence card, so it's very easy to put this in an NBN deck. I want to say that it's probably much easier to put this card in an NBN deck than it is to bring the NBN to Weyland to play this within Weyland, but there's still ways to do it. How do you play this card in Weyland? Well, you have cards like Public Trail, and Public Trail is really good. We talked about how Weyland is good at jamming agendas, keeping that money up with built to last, and then being able to say like, oh, you ran last turn, 4 credits. Do you want to take a tag or lose 8? And if the runner takes a tag, you have to hopefully that Retribution in hand. On top of that, you can splash things like, oh, this is meant to be ping. You can put cards like ping, cards like Funhouse. These are all good cards. Amusements are all good ways you could put in your Weyland deck. Mind you, this is 3 influence to get those tags to be closer to the Retribution. Now, again, I think all this stuff works better in Reality Plus. Reality Plus is built in card draw, so finding your tag punishment cards is a bit easier. You have just a higher density of cards that tag people that I don't think I'd be that excited to play cards like Funhouse in my Weyland deck. If anything, I think I might be okay playing a single copy or 1 or 2 of Public Trail, because I think you can incentivize runners to be a bit more aggressive. If you are aggressive, jamming agendas, that Public Trail might line up a bit better. Now, unfortunately, I'm arriving to the same conclusion that I did when I talked about the NBN card reviews, which a lot of times is within System Gateway. The tag punishment that exists within System Gateway is actually pretty minimal compared to some of the other core sets we've seen or the standard card pool. It shouldn't be a surprise, really. It's meant to be a lower power level to get you into the game. Not that there isn't very strong cards within System Gateway. But the idea is that if you're expecting a Weyland deck to have Retribution, or you're definitely expecting an NBN deck to have Retribution, I think all you need to really do is change how you play the game. I think you might be pretty quick to install breakers that you don't need to, and we've talked about why that's a bad thing to do generally, the Ballista case. But it's also really important against those matchups to maybe not throw out your extra copies of breakers. If you have a Unity on the table, maybe keep that other Unity in hand, because if the corporation spends Public Trail into Retribution and trashes your Unity, you'll have another Unity waiting in the wings, so that's important. But I think the most damning thing maybe about program destruction within System Gateway is that it's not a lockout the way that it could be abstractly. Because the idea is that if you do trash a Unity, there's probably another Unity in the deck if they haven't discarded it. But on top of that, runner decks have access to things like Botulus. They have access to things like Mayfly. They have access to things like Tranquilizer. There are so many other ways that runners can contest ice and deal with ice that don't rely exactly on having the exact right breaker at the exact right time. So it's hard to lock out a runner the way that you might think you'd want to. Now, admittedly, if you have a card like Spin Doctor and the runner keeps the tags consistently and doesn't go untag me, they continually take the tags, you might be able to play that Retribution over and over and over again. This is a sort of strategy I think it's more likely in a Reality Plus where there's more tags. At that point, you just think like there's like 6 cards on the table that want to tag me. If I just ignore them and take the tags, they don't do as much compared to Weyland, in which you probably can take 1 tag. Like there's a threat of a single tag every 3-4 turns or something like that. It's also worth knowing that Retribution not only trashes programs, it does trash consoles, and that's kind of fascinating. These are all the pieces of hardware. I said consoles, it's technically hardware. And I think out of all of these, I'd most likely want to trash Carnivore, just because this is the one way that Lou can fire his ability consistently and robbing him of that extra MU, which is really good with all the viruses that Lou wants to play, and removing his ability seems quite strong. Now, I think one of the biggest reasons, and this is kind of the Public Trail problem, a lot of times if you ask me, if I knew the corporation had a Retribution in hand and they played Public Trail, I probably said trial at this point already, and they played Public Trail, and my option was, would you want to spend 8 credits or trash your breaker? A lot of times I'd rather just trash my breaker. 8 credits is so much. It is really so much money That's also one of the big reasons why Retribution is, like, in theory, and something you still want in your deck, so there is tag punishment, but it's a card that respecting it, if Public Trail exists, is just way too expensive. Spending 8 credits on System Gateway just to not be Retribution is way too much money. That I'd rather just play conservatively, have extra copies of Breakers, and build a deck that has extra ways to deal with ice when necessary, as opposed to respecting it. It is, again, it's a far cry from Scorched Earth back in the day, where a single tag could easily mean death. But again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's okay that the tags are a bit less binary, where one tag equals death, and we're now more exploring a bit of the other options that happen when a runner is tagged, as opposed to being like, well, none of the other stuff matters because Scorched Earth equals death. In System Gateway, Retribution, I think, is going to see even less play. Again, we talked about this before. Paperclip, all these Anarch Breakers do they come back from the heap. It's really hard to destroy these things permanently. Shapers are running Simulchip. Again, Criminals are probably the strongest targets of Retribution, because a lot of these decks will only play a singleton of each kind of breaker because they can tutor it with mutual favor. All that being said, you can put cards in your deck to help you with these sort of matchups. You have Arc Lockdown, a 2 influence HB card that you can play that says, okay, you know, those paperclips that I've put into your archives, or your heap, excuse me, removed from game. That can help you. And again, you can compare this with things like Ballista, Trebuchet, which I think is a bit better than Ballista, and Trojan Horse. And you can build, you know, a suite. You can build a deck that does want to destroy programs and keep them trashed permanently. Still, that being said, if you can consistently tag the runner to hit them with the Retribution, at that point, you're so close to having much more tangible win conditions. Things like Boom require an additional tag, but you can probably get there. There's other tag punishment that does meat damage on a single tag, or cards like Exchange of Information. The way I see it, if the runner's tagged, I probably could kill them, as opposed to like spending the time trashing their program instead. I think it's just a big change with System Gateway, trying to change the value of a single tag, letting you explore that space a bit more before maybe you get to the standard format and understand that tags can be very, very lethal. That's Retribution. I think it's a mixed bag. For 1 influence, 1 cost, it's easy to splash into any deck as maybe a surprise tag punishment, but I think it's up to the runner to play around this card and respect it if you do think it exists. And I think it could exist in most Weyland decks, specifically if you do see a public trail, or always in every single NBN deck you play in System Gateway. I think this is our last Weyland card that we have. It is Malapert Data Vault. Malapert Data Vault. It is 1 cost. It's an upgrade. It says whenever you score an agenda from this server, you may search R&D for 1 non-agenda card and reveal it. Shuffle R&D. Reveal it means you have to show the runner, add that card to HQ. There's some great art from Owen, and it says sunlight does not touch the crater of eternal darkness, a fitting abode for the consortium's malefic secrets. Firstly, Malapert, it's just a word. It's an English word, and it means boldly disrespectful to a person of higher standing and impudent person. Good old Weyland disrespect. Love it. And the flavor text mentions the crater of eternal darkness. And from what I saw, I couldn't find an exact crater of eternal darkness, but there are a whole lot of permanently shadowed craters, not only on the moon. There's about 324 on the moon as of now, but within the solar system. And the idea is that where these craters are, with the rotation of the sun and other light sources, they have just never seen the light of day or the light of night. Space is weird. They're always been dark, which is kind of fascinating. And the idea that the Weyland Consortium will put their headquarters, the shadowy board, in the most shadowy corner of the entire universe, absolutely slaps. Big fan of this. I don't know. Do we mention it's 4 to trash? Really good. It's a really good trash ratio to res cost ratio. So this sort of card, it's a card that you set up, you score an agenda, and then you go find what you want. This is actually something that kind of showed up in the original core set. I've almost never saw this card see any play, but it says when you score an agenda this turn, search R&D for a card added to HQ. You didn't have to reveal it, which is a bit more scary, but this card was also harder to play because it actually took a click, as opposed to the Malapert, which you could set up ahead of time. So how do you use this card? You put it in your scoring remote server. If the runner runs that remote server at some point because they steal an agenda, they probably don't trash this for 4. 4 is a heck of a lot. 4 is so much, specifically also for a card that you don't have to res until you need it. And cards like this are so strong. Cards that you don't have to like res it, spend money, and then hope it's good. This card is always good as long as you are admittedly scoring agendas. So that's good. The runner has to spend 4 and you've spent nothing so far to res it. But what are you finding with this when you're scoring an agenda? Honestly, anything would be fine enough. You could pull a hedge fund and you'd be probably okay with it. You spend 1 credit and you got a card draw of a quality card you wanted at the time. Cards like Seamless Launch, I think, are a really good choice here. The idea is that you scored an agenda and now you have this threat. Sometimes the runner knows that, mind you, so they have to respect any card you put in a remote server. And now you're set up to score your next agenda. What about if you scored an agenda and you have a click left? So you can now just jam in above the law and hopefully defend a remote server and continue have that pressure, continue have that tempo. That's really good. Even if you're doing nothing like incredibly intelligent, there's no like big combo brain here. You just pull the thing that you want out of your deck and clicklessly get that value card draw. That's great. That's really quite good. You do have to remember this does shuffle your deck. So you do have to watch out. This is a May ability. Yeah, you may search. So you can actually refuse to use this if it's rezzed. So the idea is that if the runner, is like hitting conduit and they have like 4 or 5 conduit tokens, I don't know, and for some reason you're scoring an agenda instead of dealing with R&D, you will shuffle the deck. So the runner will go back and see new cards. Admittedly, sometimes this is an okay way to break R&D lock. If say the runner has jailbreaked you and they know a couple cards on the top of the deck, technically usually 1 card on the top of the deck, that is a way that you can break R&D lock. So just be careful. Shuffling the deck does have some big consequences on certain board states. Now let's talk about combos, because there are some cool combos within System Gateway to find the right thing at the right time. What about if you scored orbital superiority from that remote server with a click left? Now the runner is tagged, so you can go get the Retribution. You can play 1 Retribution in your whole deck, maybe play 2 Malaperts, and now you can spend less card slots on this card and still have it hit pretty consistently. That's awesome. That's really cool, that toolbox approach. Same thing if you're playing Tomorrow's Headline, maybe you're playing this inside NBN, you can pull out a Predicted Planogram. It's 1 influence. You can play this in Weyland as well. The idea is that the runner is tagged, you have a click left, gain 3, draw 3, and you can make sure that lines up. That's sometimes hard to line up. It is a combo, right? On top of that, I think this is one of the best ways. Send a message. If you get this brewing in the remote server, you do that sort of like that fork between the Urtica cipher, between the Clearinghouse and the send a message. You do install advance, next turn advance. Then you can do advance, score, search for a Neurospike from your deck, have 1 in your hand, hopefully, and play Neurospike into Neurospike, and they're dead. Neurospike is such a strong combo attached to 5/3 agendas. Even sometimes the runner ends with low cards in hand, you could score a 4/2 into double Neurospike. That having a card that wants to be in your hand right after you score an agenda, Malapert Data Vault lines up with that so well. That's good. It's a good value card. 1 for 4 gets you that value card draw, even if you get and just about anything, it's probably worth it. 4 trash cost. It's also, we've said this before, we've said this many times, just putting something into a remote server is good enough. A lot of times you put this in a remote server, the runner might run it, and the runner only has so many runs they can make. It costs them money. They have to put their breakers down. They have to spend their overclocks, whatever. And if they're running this just to finance a Malapert, that is your good win. And if they don't run it, this is not a card that you res until necessary. So if this has been in the remote server for a while and then you put an agenda on top of it, sometimes the runner will say like, oh, that's a Manic Arms Skunkworks. Oh, that's an Anoetic Void. That is a defensive upgrade. And so that they won't want to run the remote server because they think it is more defended than it is. Obviously, they'll find out quickly that's not the case once you res the Malapert. But the idea is that any defense, if it's face down, looks sometimes like the best defense, which is really cool. Now, outside of System Gateway, oh my God, there's some good combos. A lot of them are Neurospike combos. This is Eric's White Blades deck that he came first at a tournament undefeated. And this is the same idea, is that Neurospike is such a strong card to get. This deck runs 2 Malapert Data Vaults, and you have access to 5/3 agendas, one of them being CityWorks Project. An agenda that's almost impossible to steal once it has a lot of advancements on it. Sometimes you get those advancements on with Dedication Ceremony, and having a card that will basically ensure that you have the Neurospike when you need it makes this deck so reliable. And this works in so many factions. There's so many good Neurospike decks. Re-Education and NBN, boom, no hand size, single Neurospike lethal. Obakata, hard to steal. When you score this, it does damage if you're playing Personal Evolution, double Neurospike lethal. This is good. It does work really well in combo decks. It is 3 influence, which is pretty heavy. And we've also seen sort of decks that Titan, mind you, right now is banned in the standard card pool, but Titan Transnational decks were these fast advanced chain decks. The idea is that you would score a Project Atlas, it would have a counter on it, you would use that counter to find your next fast advance piece to score the next Project Atlas, and you could close the game out really quickly. And while I don't think Malapert Data Vault was a perfect slot into those sort of decks, it allows any fast enough Weyland deck to have that Titan Transnational sort of ability. If you score out early in a remote server, you can go get that biotic labor, that trickle light, that audacity that you want, score out the next agenda quickly in the remote server, get the next piece you need, and then you're off to the races. There's also some cool combos. Armed Intimidation. This is a really fun card. It's a 4/2. When you score it, the runner has a choice. Take 5 meat damage. Sometimes they can't afford to do that. Or take 2 tags. And if they take 2 tags, well, you can choose. You technically, if you have 2 abilities that are when you score, you choose the order of them. So you can say, do Armed Intimidation first. The runner makes their choice. And then you say, okay, you took the tags. I'm going to go find tag punishment. Or you took the damage. I'm going to go find net damage. I don't honestly know what net damage looks like. I think this is what we have for net damage modernly. On top of that, NBN, you have cards. There's some really wild stuff. Fly on the Wall is basically like Remastered Edition, but slightly worse. You can go pull your tag punishment when you need it. Score out a Remastered Edition. This lets you fast advance 3 2s out of hand. Go get a 3-2 advance agenda. I played some really fun decks on stream against the player who was scoring a license acquisition. When it was scored, they would use their Malapert to go get a Sansan City grid so that they can install it for free with license acquisition. Super wacky, super cool. You could get technically any big asset, right? Or upgrade. A Mega Pre-Qualifier, you get one scored, you go find the next one, it's worth 3-2. Nisei Mark II, you just score it, you probably have a good remote server, go get something. Probably not worth the influence. This is the deck that won Worlds last year. And mind you, this deck did just take a big hit because of changes to the most wanted list. This card did get banned, but I think a lot of people expected Malapert Data Vault to show up in decks like these. These are combo decks that can score multiple agendas in a turn using some in the same turn, using some cool combos. And while we haven't seen it yet, Malapert Data Vault exists as a real threat to this sort of archetype. A really strong piece in these sort of archetypes in which they can go get what they need when they need it and continue to fast advance pieces out. If you get some extra clicks, you know, with that sort of Sansan City grid, you can go get another agenda that you can score quickly in the Sansan City grid. You can get your calibration testings. You can go get your, there's so many cards that you can get with this that help you combo out your red level clearance. So you can like clicklessly install your, excuse me, I hit the microphone, your red level clearance. You can install your calibration testings. There's like a really high ceiling for combo shenanigans that this card could make possible. It's a bit of struggle for me to figure out what it is now that Game Changer, the one card that could give you like 5-6 extra clicks, has rotated or been banned more accurately, but there's some threat there for sure. And that's Malapert Data Vault. I think it's such a cool card. I think it's probably a bit understated. I haven't seen a lot of this. I haven't seen this see play in just good stuff decks. I think a lot of times this is only going to see play if there is a really good combo. I think in System Gateway, just using this to get the next best card you want in your deck is good enough, but the combo decks are really going to love this. I like this card a lot. Now, if I'm not mistaken, now that is all of the 8 Weyland cards within System Gateway. We have 3 neutral cards to go over after this. In short, I'm actually a big fan of these Weyland cards. We talked about how this is a big difference from like the old Scorched Earth back of the day, the Weyland that the only thing they really wanted to do was go ahead and kill you. I'm still not a big fan of the advanceable ice thing. I just don't like it. Above the Law is a fantastic agenda. I love how Built to Last does help advanceable ice, but also still lets you play an aggressive rush deck, and I like that a heck of a lot. I'm a big fan of Clearinghouse. Government Subsidy, I think, teaches really good fundamentals of money needed to make money, and Malapert Data Vault is also a really fun card. I find Built to Last to be, I think, my favorite to play within System Gateway. I think Precision Design is also a lot of fun. But just having that tempo, allowing yourself to go fast and make plays, as opposed to sitting back and clicking for credits, which is usually the worst part of Netrunner. I love that it gives you that the acceleration. I'm a big fan. And I love that there's still a threat. Above the Law is there, Clearinghouse is there. Color me excited. We just have 3 more neutral cards to round out our System Gateway review. And our first today is Hedge Fund. It's 5 credits for this transaction operation. Very simple. Gain 9 credits. The flavor text, a financial instrument for diverting money from those outside to those inside. It's a neutral card. Now, I struggled to talk about Sure Gamble, I think, too intelligently when we talked about it on the runner side. This is just the corpse version of Sure Gamble. Sure Gamble 5 for 9. It's a staple. And this card is really important. I guess to some extent, you could say it's more important for the corporation than the runner. But at that point, I don't think you're really saying too much. You really need money to do just about anything in this game. If you want to res ice, that's going to be money. You want to score agendas, it's going to be money. If you want any sort of win condition, that's generally attached to money. So ensuring that your deck has money in it is really important. In Hedge Fund, spending a single click for 4 credits is way better than just about everything else in the game. We talked about Hansei Review and Government Subsidy that have some really harsh conditions attached to it. Hedge Fund is very, very playable as a 3 of in just about every deck. Mind you, I think it is the most common corp card across all decks of all time in Netrunner. It's been around since the original core set because it is so efficient and so playable. You can play this turn 1. Having a Hedge Fund in your opening hand just opens up possibilities. The runner has to respect what ice you have. At 9 credits, you can res just about anything. You can protect generally HQ and R&D on the same turn. You can generally build a remote server and res something behind it. It gives you so many options so quickly. And to some extent, you run into the exact same rules with Government Subsidy. And it's a bit different, but if you can keep the corp down low on credits, they can struggle sometimes to get to that Hedge Fund limit and to be able to score out of it, or not score out of it, to get credits on top of that. So if you see a corporation on 0 credits and you can threaten their money, one of the best things to do is continue to be aggressive. Because if they have to spend credits resing ice, if they're on 3 or 4 credits, well, they might not want to res ice if they have a Hedge Fund in hand. It's exactly like Government Subsidy. If they're on 3 credits, they probably not want to res ice because next turn they want to do credit, Hedge Fund. Hedge Fund is so incredibly important. And this is a weird thing we also saw on the runner side. We've seen cards like this, like Beanstalk Royalties. This is no longer in the standard format, but this card saw next to no play in standard, while a card this is way easier to play. It's a click for 3 credits, but somehow the magical breakpoint we've all decided is to click for 4 credits. That is art. I don't know why. I think Beanstalk is probably playable. I think you're happier to open with Hedge Fund obviously in your hand, and Beanstalk saw some play in some niche decks that would go to low credits, but Hedge Fund is just such a strong card, and it's almost, I don't see any situation in which it wouldn't be a 3 of in every single deck. Okay, I say that, but then I have a really awkward follow-up here. There are some decks that won't play 3 of Hedge Funds. This deck almost won Worlds last year. And the sort of decks that don't play 3 Hedge Funds, generally the only ones you see that in are asset-based decks. And controlling the message has an ability that generally only, it incentivizes you to play a lot of like remote servers with upgrades or assets in them because they're pretty well protected by this Trace 4 Take a Tag. And decks like this will run 23 assets, and a lot of them are economic assets. You have the bankers groups, you have things like Maryland Campaign, the Mumba Temple is technically value, Nasex, Pad Campaign, Rashida Yahim. These are all economy cards. And so a lot of times these decks would rather turn 1, instead of play Hedge Fund, play 2 assets on the table that the runner might struggle to trash. There are still some very competitive controlling the message decks that would play Hedge Fund in them, but sometimes these sacrifices were made where some decks, the assets are more valuable than having those operations. This is an old Gagarin Deep Space deck. It's not a legal thing in standard card pool anymore, but this deck also wouldn't run Hedge Funds. It just wants to run a lot of assets, and a lot of them would make money because their game plan was to get a lot of assets on the table. So that's technically true. I think there might be more corporation decks that would not play Hedge Fund more than runner decks not play Sure Gamble. Just because it's hard to build an economy with only resources and hardware and other means as a runner, but with a corporation, it's definitely possible to prop your economy entirely off of assets. That being said, it's rare, and I still think there's a lot of good asset decks that would include 3 Hedge Funds for some good early pressure. Sometimes you have to watch out for mining accident. That was actually a big thing at a time where this card was really good against assets, and having extra money was really powerful. That's Hedge Fund. It's good. A click for 4 credits is just the baseline of just the best you can ask for. And that's why you see cards like Hansei Review and Government Subsidy having real costs associated with them. If the runner's on low credits, the corp's on low credits, keep them pressured because they'll be clicking up to 5. Our next neutral card is Regolith Mining License. This is a neutral asset, excuse me. It says when you res this asset, load 15 credits onto it. 15 credits, those comes from the bank. You don't have to pay that. And when it's empty, you trash it. As a click, you can take 3 credits from this asset. And there's some flavor text that says the economy of 3 worlds is sustained by HE3 extraction from the lunar surface. The very fulcrum of power, the key to collective survival, auctioned to the highest bidder. Signed the Catalyst, who's the neutral runner from System Gateway. So a couple things. Firstly, regolith is a word. Regolith refers to the loose, heterogeneous, superficial deposits covering solid rock. This is the sort of dust that you see on Moon, Mars, Earth, asteroids, and it looks like we're mining it. I think I clumsily said He3, that's helium-3. which is a real thing. It's a light stable isotope of helium with 2 protons and 1 neutron. I'm not too familiar with chemistry, but this shows up heavily in the lore of Android Netrunner as the thing that powers a lot of power. Blue Sun, if I'm not mistaken, uses He3, helium-3, to produce an immense amount of power that powers, I reckon, most things on the moon and maybe even back on Earth. So there's a lot of money to be made here in mining as helium-3. There's a lot of cards that reference helium-3. Also really fun. You see the corpos are looking down on this table with these yellow kind of like walking robots. And that's actually the art on Teleware Contract. Teleware Contract is shaper card. That's your job. And the idea is that if you're working here piloting these mining drones, that's actually you working for the Regolith mining license, which is a really cool crossover. Now this card, I like it more than I think I do. I think you install it, you res it for 2, and then you can spend clicks taking 3 credits off of this. And I think this card might be dismissed because it does look very similar to other cards we've seen that are similar. This is Private Contracts, a pretty old card all the way back from 2012. Some of the original Netrunner cards post the core set. It's a very similar idea, but the numbers on this card are a fair bit worse. While the trash cost is higher and there's less money on it, it reses for more. As a click, you're only taking 2 credits off of this. We talked about 4 credits per click being the magic number, and you're obviously not going to get that with the Telework, or sorry, the Regolith, because you have to install it, res it for 2, and then take money off of it. But the idea that clicking for 3, that's a lot of money. This offloads much quicker than Private Contracts, but also it's cheaper to res, which is nice. You'll get closer to a profit a bit quicker. Another comparable card is a Melange Mining Campaign. And Melange Mining Campaign did have a really powerful card within the original core sets. If you could get this up behind a single piece of ice in the early game, you would just smash this button over and over again for 7 credits. And that was a lot of money. The original core set of Netrunner didn't have a lot of economy. And I think Regolith largely is that same way. This is a card that I'm so interested to get behind a piece of ice in the early game, and I want to protect it because this is so much money. The amount of money in the system gateway, it's pretty limited. And this is, if you can empty all of this, this is what, 13 credits. Admittedly, it's going to take you 6 clicks to get there, but 6 clicks for 13 credits is better than 2 credits per click, which is actually like with what a lot of like runner and corp cards are kind of measured off of. I think this is good. And a big deal how this is better than Melange is that this is not your whole turn. I like this a lot, is that if I get this in a remote server and I get it protected, I can still take money off the Regolith while also continuing to build my board state. I can do install an ice on R&D that I just drew and then take twice off the Regolith. It lets me take money while also doing the thing I want to do. And that is so good. It's flexible. It also, again, I talked about this before, we said it before, that it clears a bit quicker so that the server that you've just emptied, it'll empty faster. So you have a new server to jam agendas in. It kind of scratches a lot of boxes pretty well. In terms of economy within System Gateway, it's pretty limited. There's not a lot of cards that give you money. It shows up as a 2 in just about every deck that I've built in System Gateway, and I'm pretty happy to draw it. If you draw it in the early game, you do want to protect it, and you've probably spent some time protecting it just so you can get the most money off of it. And the runner does want to trash it. When I'm playing the runner, a lot of times I'll keep an early botches in my hand, not only to contest agendas, but a lot of times I just want to contest that early Regolith. And it's really important to trash the Regolith if you can. If you take this down in the early game after the corporations installed this and maybe taken 6 credits off of it, you're still denying them 9 credits. That's a lot of money and it's definitely worth doing. Now in the mid to late game where maybe you don't want the money or you don't need the money, it's still fine enough as something you can put in the remote server. And putting things in the remote server is really important. If the only thing you're putting in remote servers are agendas, the runner doesn't have to run that often. And that means that they can save up their money, they can save up their abilities like overclock or tread lightly and only run when it matters. It's kind of in your best interest to put as many things in the remote server over time so that they struggle to figure out when to run it and overextend sometimes when it's not an agenda. I like it. And sometimes in the late game, even if you take 3 credits off of this, 6 credits, trash it, install something else, you're fine. Outside of System Gateway, I think where there's much more economy options, I think this is going to see much more limited play. I still think this is technically nichely playable in some decks that might struggle for economy. There's some nice interactions. Mirror Morph specifically wants you to do 3 different things on a turn. And having access to a card like this, which is an easy 3 credits a turn, that's nice. And it allows you to get to your Mirror Morph quickly. Admittedly, we do have cards like Nano Etching Matrix that kind of scratch that same itch. And maybe this is just a nicer card in your deck. On top of that, Earth Station, sometimes you can just flip your Earth Station ability turn 1, Ice HQ, and then in the following turn, get this in the remote server. Even if it's not iced, I don't know if the runner can spend 9 credits to bring this thing down, and then you can finish this thing off and then build your remote server. Admittedly, it can be awkward when you draw into the mid to late game with only a single remote server because you want this there for a couple turns and a couple clicks, but honestly, it's a pretty good way to start. And finally, Near Earth Hub. I've been actually playing this as a one of in or two of even in the startup format, which is a bit of a more limited format between standard and system gateway, as a card that draws you a card when it gets into a remote server. And if I do ice it up, I can click it for money, which is nice. And probably not necessary, but you do get additional value from it being a new remote server if you don't want to ice it up. And then eventually you do ice it up and kind of like it. I'm a fan. In short, I think this card is much better than it might look compared to like private contracts and the things that some of the older Netrunner players might be compared to. I don't think it's a competitive card, but within system gateway specifically, it's such an important thing to ice up, and it's going to give you a lot of money. And I'm very excited to put these in my system gateway decks where the economy options are not that robust. And our last card that we've actually referred to a lot is Palisade, the barrier within system gateway, the neutral barrier, mind you. Cost 3 to res, it's only 2 strength, but when it's protecting a remote server, it's 4 strength. Single subroutine, end the run, keep the neighbors honest. And a Palisade, mind you, you get a bit of an idea here from the art, and I'm a big fan of Scott Dominguez's art, it's a wall made out of logs, usually sharpened. These are pretty simple to set up, I suppose. I probably couldn't do it myself, but it's a nice wall. And talking about a wall as a barrier, this is the reimagination of the old core set barrier wall of static. And I just love how they took wall of static, the most vanilla there's a card called vanilla card, and they made it much more interesting by just tweaking one small thing, making it a positional ice. On a remote server, 4 strength, that's where you want it. And on a central server, 2 strength. And firstly, I love this because it teaches good fundamentals about ice placement. Not all ice is made equally, and you want certain ice on certain places. And cards like this that aren't in theory taxing, specifically if you get this on a central server with its only being 2 strength, it's not going to cost a lot for a runner to break this. And so cards like this that just end the run and force an answer, a lot of times you want those on a remote server because in the early game, that's what you want to score an agenda behind. And the design of this just like naturally incentivizes better play. Corporations see this and think like, oh, it's stronger on a remote server. I'm gonna put this on a remote server, and then they'll end up putting something more taxing, but that doesn't necessarily end the run on R&D. And that's generally what you should be doing. So the idea that this card, in theory, in a pinch, you could put it on a central server if you needed to, but it really incentivizes you to put it the place where it belongs. That ability to move itself around makes it really interesting and makes Tau a bunch more interesting too, which is really good within the set. There's positional ice that Tau can goof on. It's Palisade. It's honestly a really good ice. 4 strength barrier. That's generally a lot of times what I'm scoring my agendas in the early game. Maybe I can get a code gate in front of it. You put that with the Mana Garm Skunk Works. That is a really good server, even for a big part of the game. 4 strength is also really nice. For Marjana, that's very expensive. They're breaking that for generally 5 credits for something you resed for 3. Quite okay. If you look at Cleaver, 4 strength is the beautiful number because they actually have to boost 2 credits. So it costs them 3 credits to break something that you resed for 3 credits. That parity is, you can't really ask for better than that within System Gateway. That's fantastic. Now, those numbers will change as soon as somebody gets a leech down, but for now, that's the best you have. And it's also, Cleaver is one of the big reasons why you almost never want to put a Palisade on a central server, because at that point, they're breaking it for 1 instead of breaking it for 3. It's a huge difference. I like it. I put this as a 3 of in every single System Gateway deck I've played, and it is honestly one of the best dice. I've said before that I'd a lot of times rather Palisade than a Pharos on most of my lists, and I really do think that's true. Now, if you go and look at all the barriers in the whole standard format, there's 34 of them. And Palisade is kind of interesting because the barriers are not, I don't think, distributed evenly between the factions. HB right now is pretty good. They have some pretty good barriers. Jinteki is really weird. They only actually have 2 barriers within standard format. Kakugo, mind you, right now is banned. One of them costs 12 credits and the other one is Envelope, which is okay. So I think actually this is a card that you could consider playing in Jinteki decks because there's not a lot of options. NBN is pretty good, and I think Weyland is actually really quite good. So Jinteki is actually really interesting. If you look at Startup, which is the format again between Standard and System Gateway, I think Palisade looks really good when you realize Jinteki has literally 0 barriers, which is kind of buck wild. Also, if you can compare Eli 1.0, Eli 1.0 used to be classically one of the best ice in the game. This was a long time ago. Things are different. But Eli 1.0 is 3 strength, 4 subroutines with, 3 cost, 4 strength with 2 subroutines. And mind you, the runner can click through them. That's not that far different than Palisade wins on a remote server. Now, Eli's only 1 influence, so you can easily splash that. Not that Palisade's neutral, so you can easily splash it. But it's like comparable to one of the ice that used to be one of the better ice in the whole game. Not that Eli sees too much play modernly. But I wouldn't actually be too upset to play Palisade. I just think there are a lot of decks right now. Hagen is a really good barrier. Gold Farmer, if you're playing, it is legal, and Startup is really good. And Weyland, Aket is good, but I'd rather play Palisade than Ice Wall, that's for sure. Sunstone is fine too. I don't know, it's strange that I'm so jazzed about a card that's like so boring, but this card actually has really good numbers on it. It is a fair bit better. Not that people love Bastion. Do you want just value Bastion? I feel like I do want value Bastion. What's wrong with me? Anywho, I like Palisade. I'll just say it. I feel better now. Those are, where's my tab? Those are the Weyland cards and all 3 neutral cards, but most importantly, that's all the system gateway cards. This is a long video. We talked about all of them if you watch the whole series. My God, that's awesome. I'm glad you're as stoked about this as I am. That was like 14 hours of content. I would love to hear what you think about these Weyland cards. If there's something that we've missed, some interactions, some decks, if you think my evaluation is wrong or not the way you see it, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. We read and respond to all of that as we can. Again, that's also all of System Gateway. As a closing remark, I think System Gateway is, as much as I've dunked on certain cards and, you know, certain identities don't work out or ideas work out the same way that they did in the original core set, this is by a mile the best intro Netrunner product that Netrunner has ever had for so many reasons. The way that it's introduced, we didn't talk about the idea that these decks come in like, this is your intro teaching deck, this is your slightly more interesting deck, and then this is the card for deck building. There's very little like straight chaff in here. Like there's a lot of cards, you can play all these cards and not feel terrible about them. I think once maybe you start playing with a bigger card pool, you might reevaluate some of those decisions, but it's really good as an onboarding device. And I'm so stoked that Nisei nailed this, because this game obviously wants and needs something like this to get people on board, because the core sets are really hard to get. And even then, they're not as good as stuff is. So huge shout outs to Nisei. I think that's it though. We got through everything. That took a while. Apologies. I wish that came through faster. From now on, we got to figure out what kind of video content we want to put on this channel. There's a lot of ideas. We want to do some replay reviews. We want to talk about some fundamental stuff, but we are streaming on this channel every Thursday at 8:45 Eastern. If you want to drop in here or on Twitch, again, if you like this video or subscribe to the channel, you will get notifications. If you subscribe, if you like, it's just cool, I guess. I think that's largely it. Thanks for watching. Ciao.